you're living in a society that is so safe and prosperous and comfortable that the greatest risk to your life is your own hands. There's ingredients and chemicals and weird things that are put in here that are not put in the food in Europe or in Australia and so on. As soon as someone crosses that line, right, and hits someone, you shoot someone, attack someone, no, right? And that's where the rule of law is extremely important. There can't be a tolerance of that. There can't be a tolerance of, okay, well, you were justified because he thought the wrong thing.
So the big thing for us in the US is the border.
Okay.
I'll give you one of my favorite Thomas Sowell quotes. It's really interesting. The first time I heard this, it hit me as so counterintuitive, but I think he's right. If there is any place in the Guinness Book of World Records for the words repeated the most often over the most years without one speck of evidence, diversity should be a prime candidate. Is diversity our strength or anybody's strength anywhere in the world? It has not been our diversity, but our ability to overcome the problems inherent with diversity and to act together as Americans. That has been our strength. So when I look at people streaming over the border, I'm like, hey, we should probably check at a minimum, like, do you believe in the country that exists, or are you coming in to remake the country over? Because otherwise we end up in a values war. And I'm not even saying my values are right. I'm just saying that people are going to fight for their values.
Yes.
Now, I have a value system that forces me to say, well, you want human flourishing. And if your value system is suboptimal at delivering human flourishing, you should update your belief system.
Yes.
So I'm super here for that. But I don't think that you get there by just randomly dumping people from all over the world with no filtering mechanism whatsoever and just like fingers crossed, hope for the best.
Agreed.
Given that I think that Thomas Sowell is right. That you actually have to overcome all that diversity.
And everyone used to know that that was a bad idea, right? That didn't used to be a quote unquote right-wing position, right? Everyone, Democrat, Republican.
Border or diversity?
Oh, sorry, the border.
Yeah. Because I think people have because diversity feels so good, like it feels so right. For me anyway, the way I was raised, whatever, the way I'm hardwired, that is a heartwarming belief that I love the most.
I'll tell you what, I think people have a very shallow understanding and usage of diversity these days. I think it's become this buzzword, which is oftentimes, I mean, when it's used by certain people, certain progressives, for example, they really just mean different skin color, genders, and sexualities, but you all think the same way, right? That's really what they mean. Because as soon as there's someone who's a black or brown conservative, they're not big fans, right? Or when someone steps outside their, very quite rigid ideology, it's not a very liberal ideology. They're not huge fans of freedom of speech even. They don't like that. So I think that I get asked a lot about, the sort of diversity question. The first thing is, maybe there's multiple things to say. The first thing is that I think that natural diversity is generally good.
What's natural diversity?
Diversity that the human beings is a diverse species. And so if you have a meritocracy and you have fairness and reasonable access and equality of opportunity, you will naturally get diversity. If you run
thought
of everything, if you run a company or you have a sports event or a music event or anything, and you just are like, we just want the best people. We want the fastest runners. We want the best basketball players. We want the best programmers. We want the best engineers or whatever. There is a natural level, because talent is distributed. It's not just like, oh, okay, all the people from this place or of this skin color or of this nationality are just all the best at this thing. And so they all go in there. There's just a natural level of diversity that takes place. You don't need to have quotas or affirmative action or try to force it in this direction or that direction. Talent is distributed. Is it completely equally across all groups? No. And people have different interests and proclivities and backgrounds. You want to make it even more obvious, just look between the two genders. Okay? Males and females, right? Like, we have different interests. We have generally across, as whole populations, we have different strengths and weaknesses. There are certain fields where, okay, if you just take the best people out of the people who are interested in it, you're going to end up with 95% men and 5% women in this. And in this area, you're going to end up with 95% women, 5% men, and so whatever. My personal view is, as long as there is no one's being unfairly discriminated against, then cool, let people do what they want to do. I'm not on the bandwagon of, hey, we need to get everything 50-50 and make sure everything perfectly reflects the population, because you can't do that without actual sexist and or racist policies to discriminate against people who are more likely to go into that area. If you want 50% of airline pilots to be female, you will have to unfairly discriminate against men.
Let's say, though, that you're not stupid, and
Okay.
so you're not going to try to get everything to equal the population. That is a child's view
Yeah, it's
of
silly.
how to make this work. But you really do look out at the world. I'll give you the easy one. Okay. So you look out at the world and you realize that certain zip codes have terrible fucking education. And so it's like, oh, okay, that's broken. And because of the history of slavery in the country, that you started this feeder system of people into a broken system. And I know I'm making, because obviously there was a moment where it really looked like blacks were going to escape and Black Wall Street and all that. Like I'm way oversimplifying, but nonetheless, a stretch of people, whether white, black, otherwise, doesn't matter. They find themselves in poverty. And now they're just in a poverty creation machine.
Yes.
And that is the zip code that they're born into. And so now you're like, it would be absurd to get equal percentages everywhere. But at the same time, I actually do want to fix the real fucking problem.
Yep.
So how do we do that?
I think you go to the root of the problem. Okay. Something like 72% of Black Americans born in this country are born to unmarried parents. That is a problem. Only 28%-ish, 25 to 28% being born to married parents. That is a gigantic issue. People don't like to talk about this because it makes people uncomfortable and certain people feel convicted or feel like you're attacking them or something like that. But if you can't talk about a problem openly, you certainly have no chance of fixing it. So that is one of the roots of the issue. The family structure. What are the environments people are growing up in? Is there even a father in the home? Are there fathers in the community? If the answer is mostly no, you can actually just accurately predict everything from education success to long-term income to incarceration rates, crime rates, poverty rates, so on and so forth. They're all correlated. You find the communities with the highest rates of intact families and fathers in the households. They also, lo and behold, they have the lowest incarceration rates, highest incomes, highest educational attainment, and so on and so forth. So these things are, firstly, you have to be able to like really just be truthful about the issue and get to the core of it and all the different factors, right? I'm not saying that's the one factor. I'd say it's certainly one of the biggest, if not the biggest. And that's also a multi-generational fix. It didn't happen overnight like that, and you can't just fix it like that. And it's not something that you just make a political policy which suddenly improves it. So I think I'm speaking here as a foreigner, but as a foreigner who cares about the USA and does want to see people flourish across the board. And I think in that specific situation, I think you need the long-term solution, which is, okay, let's look right at the root. Let's look right at the root of this and see what's going on here. And let's have a multi-decade plan to remedy this. And then you might need to have some type of interim solution. I know that a lot of conservatives here talk about school choice. That's not something I've looked into that much. You certainly need to invest in improving certain schools and communities. If it's just like, okay, this is a poor area and therefore all the schools suck, that shouldn't necessarily be the situation, right? And it doesn't have to be. That's not an inevitable situation that, oh, this is a poor community, so the schools are just garbage, right? No, I don't think Americans should just accept that. I don't think they should just accept and tolerate that. This is the richest country in the world. We've got trillions and trillions and trillions in debt, but also
a lot more trillions. If
right?
we're talking about debt.
But also being sent overseas and going to the military-industrial complex and so on. Like there's so much wasteful spending.
That's my point. This is what's driving the question.
Yes, let's redirect this towards our own citizens. I'm not American, but I am America first for Americans, right? That shouldn't be some controversial thing or some things that's viewed as some fringe right-wing view or something. It's like, no, these
Also,
are the
I don't
citizens.
think-
These
I
are
don't
these
think
are
it
the
matters.
taxpayers. So that money and funding, the education's a really basic foundational thing. If the next generation of Americans coming up is not well educated, and a lot of them don't even know how to read and write properly and do basic math, like that's not, the things ain't looking good in 30, 40, 50 years if that's the situation across millions and millions of people. And I don't think it's a gigantic ask that, hey, how about we make it so that every American child graduating from 9th grade can read and do math properly. I don't think that's like a crazy utopian, like that should be basic. In most countries, that's basic. That's like, yeah, of course they can read and they can do math and they have basic understanding of certain things. But I think that, I'll tell you what, I don't think I've ever even said this before, but I think in this country and in the UK as well, I think people need to like raise their standards and expectations in a way.
Of what?
I think that just because, I think people get used to things. And sometimes people get used to things that they shouldn't. I'll give you a parallel. So my family's originally from Nigeria. In Nigeria, for the past several decades, my entire lifetime, you've been dealing with power cuts, blackouts. Sometimes multiple times a day, 3, 4 times a day, every single day for the past 40, 50 years, blackouts. And it's been going on for so long that every Nigerian, whether in Nigeria or in the diaspora, is just kind of like, that's just how it is, right? That's just how it is. And I'm like, you shouldn't tolerate that. Nigeria exports oil to other countries. Countries like Ghana haven't had, they've been free of blackouts for 2 decades at this point. Why is Nigeria still having blackouts? That's goofy. How are they having petrol shortages in a country with as much oil resources as it does? Like, guys, come on. We shouldn't just be like, oh, well, that's just how it is, right? That's just America. Oh, that's just the American education system. No. Why should America have a crap education system compared to other countries in Europe or in Asia or in the Middle East? Why should the US be behind in that? It shouldn't be. It shouldn't be. Like, this country has stupidly blessed nation. I mean, ridiculous amounts of resources, so much money, so many entrepreneurs, so much going on. And people just kind of like accept that, oh, well, like, our education system's just crap and getting worse. I'm like, no. Or when people kind of give up on the cities when it comes to crime or homelessness and like drugs and stuff, and they're just like, well, it's just like that. It's like, no, it shouldn't be. Firstly, it wasn't always like that. It wasn't always that way. And we're moving in the future, not in the past. So it should, at least in theory, be getting better. It should be improving. It shouldn't be like, oh, each year, Los Angeles or San Francisco or California or wherever you are, oh, it's just like declining. You're paying more in taxes and it's declining. I firstly think like there just needs to be more, what's the right word I'm looking for? I think there's too much apathy. I think there's an acceptance of the unacceptable. And I think that should not be the case.
Does it feel accurate if I call that culture? We have a culture of apathy.
See, I don't think Americans generally have this, though. I think America has one of the most optimistic culture of any country that I've been to, and I've been to over 40.
Moving in the right direction, holding steady, trending down.
The culture?
Yeah, an outsider's view.
U.S. as a whole is difficult just because it's so big. It's so big and there's 50 different states. I would say that in some ways, okay, let's expand the time horizon a little bit, because I think it's easy to get caught up in kind of the last 5 to 10 years. Let's do 100 years. Let's look from 1924 to 2024. I think pretty much everyone would agree that the country has made massive strides in progress in the past 100 years. Regardless of your skin color or income level, or whether you're a man or a woman, or you're straight or you're gay or whatever, I think it's very clearly overall trended in a positive direction. I think the world has in general. I think in the last 10 to 15 years, there have been elements of decline and elements of regression as well as elements of progression. I think a lot of it actually stems from an absence of perspective and gratitude. So one reason why I appreciate America so much is because I have a wide global perspective. So I appreciate the USA often in a way that a lot of Americans who have never left it don't, because this is just kind of like the default, and they haven't been to other parts of the world and seeing how people live and seeing the opportunities and lack thereof. And they're just like, okay, well, you know, this is just kind of it. And with an absence of perspective can come an absence of gratitude. And I think that when you are not grateful for something, no matter what it is, it could even be a relationship, you often tend to undermine and destroy it sometimes without even trying. And when I look at the USA and the way the culture is going right now, I see a lot of elements of self-destruction. I think the same is true of the UK, maybe not to the same extent, but it's similar. I mean, I know for certain in the UK, I don't know if this statistic holds true in the US as well, but it will certainly be close. But if you look at, say, like men under 50, what's the most common cause of death?
Suicide.
Yourself. When you really think about that, that's deep.
Mm-hmm.
So you're living in a society that is so safe and prosperous and comfortable that the greatest risk to your life is your own hands. That's crazy, right? Like that when you really think of it, like that is nuts. Like that just strikes at the heart of like, okay, there's something really fundamentally wrong here. So we have overcome to a large degree all of the things that have been killing humanity for all of these thousands of wars, war, pestilence, famine, malnutrition, all these things. There's more people dying of eating too much than not having enough to eat. So we're in this weird age of decadence and excess and surplus to a point where on an individual and collective level, there's a kind of harakiri, like a kind of suicide that is going on culturally, where it's turning, the guns and knives are turning inwards. And I don't know exactly what to make of that. But when I think of cultural decline, that is the attitude and some of those behaviors that I'm referring to. I mean, in the US, over 100,000 people died of overdoses last year. 100,000. And that's deaths. So for each of those, I'm sure there's a multiple of people who did overdose, but they didn't die, right? And then I believe there's another 100,000 on top of that that's alcohol, right? So that's, and then you've got like the actual suicides. And so you've got hundreds of thousands of people just in this country, particularly young and middle-aged men who are, for whatever reason, there's a variety of factors here, but they're taking themselves out. Yeah. And I think that this is also happening on a social and a cultural level.
If you want to have a solid strategy in place to grow your business, you need to have a very clear and accurate picture of the business finances as your starting point. But managing finances has historically been a tedious and time-consuming task that very few entrepreneurs want to make time for or even have time for. Now, however, you can revolutionize the way you manage your business finances with QuickBooks, the #1 accounting software for small businesses. Bookkeeping with QuickBooks is easy, with one place to track expenses and inventory, organize and manage bills, send invoices, calculate tax and deductions, and compare projects for profitability. And with QuickBooks Payroll, you can streamline payday, track time, manage HR, and offer team benefits. So discover why 88% of customers say QuickBooks helps their business be more successful and save yourself time by bundling bookkeeping and payroll. Just click the link below to get 50% off 3 months of QuickBooks Payroll. Try it today.
You've got people who are ashamed to see or put up an American flag.
Yes.
Right. Or who want to burn it, or who will say we need to dismantle, destroy, the whole, all of America is a racist, white supremacist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic country, and we need to destroy the whole thing. Like with these people, I know they haven't traveled. Firstly, because I'm always like, a question I like to ask is compared to what? You know, I've had interviews where someone will ask me, Zuby, do you think the UK is a racist country? Zuby, do you think America is a racist country? Compared to what? Like compared to utopia, where everyone is zero bigotry and everyone's then okay, yeah, I mean, yes, there's some racism. Like compared to the rest of the world, no. Compared to history, absolutely not. And I think that needs to be celebrated more. I think a big problem we're having in the West is I think people haven't looked up to see the progress that has been made, the true progress. Like the harmony amongst different groups, the fact that this diversity, sure, the diversity thing is, it's become a bit of a buzzword and people have their different takes on it. But in the true sense, people have become way more tolerant in the good way, far less violent and hostile towards each other, far less bigoted, far less any of these isms and phobias that people worry about. They've declined so sharply. Not so long ago, I mean, this country had segregation. Last year, I went to South Africa twice. I mean, in my lifetime, they ended racial segregation over there. Like, it's not that long. It's just not that long ago. And it's interesting. Have you been to South Africa?
No.
It's interesting over there because you can still kind of feel and see the aftershocks of it.
Sure.
Yeah. So it's interesting because you can be in some places and it almost feels like I'm in like middle England, you know, like I think white people there are maybe 15% of the population, but there's some places which are like, you know, it's like totally white, or you go to a bar or something and it's like, oh, this is like a white bar. You know what I mean?
School of fish, man.
And then there's other places where it's like, you know, if you were to see a white person, it's like, whoa, like what's that? What's that person doing there? So because the desegregation there is more recent, you can also sense that it's hard to put into words, but you can kind of see and feel it a little bit more over there compared to other countries. And so I think we need to celebrate those successes more, man. I think there's always different ways to look at history and to look at the history of a country. And you could certainly look at America's history or British history, look at the British Empire, right? And you could certainly paint it as, you know, just all built on racism and white supremacy and slavery and segregation and discrimination and violence and lynchings and brutality and so on. Like there's a lot of stuff that you can use to paint that story. And someone can choose to do that, and they can choose to be resentful and hold people's ancestors responsible for things that they didn't even do if you want. I don't think that's very helpful or pro-social.
What story should we be telling?
I think it's a story of continual progress and triumph over these human sins. The triumph over slavery, triumph over segregation, triumph over extreme tribalism, triumph over intolerable violence, triumph over, I mean, even in the last few decades, right? Like we now live in this time where, you know, people are talking about, you know, the LGBT acronym keeps on growing. But like a few decades ago, gay bashing really was a thing, right? There were people who thought, oh, like that person's gay, like let's beat him up because he's gay. Like, no. Like it's so intolerable to even kind of think of now, but not so long ago it was normal. Dude, at its peak, the KKK had about 4 million members.
Whoa.
Members, not sympathizers. Right? Like actual white supremacy. And keep in mind the population was smaller then. Right? So like at the peak of like white supremacy in America and racism in America, they had, it's estimated, some people say, you know, 3 to 4 million. So, I mean, I don't know number wise what that means, but maybe like 1 in 15 or 1 in 20 white guys being a member of the KKK, right? And they were in Congress, they were in the police force, they were in all these types of things. So when you're hearing these people like in this day and age, you know, screaming about white supremacy and this and this and this, again, it's that, man, like compared to what? Like how many real, like genuine white supremacists are in this country? Like a few thousand? Are there any in like Congress or in like leading police forces or whatever? Like So there's been huge amounts of progress that have been made. And I think if people can appreciate that, I think it's always important to, on an individual level too, right, to celebrate the successes. And you realize there's work to still do, right? There's improvement to still make. We've been talking about that. There's things that can still be better. Some things can be very significantly better. But in striving towards that, let's not be so reckless to just throw away the last 50 or 100 years and pretend that no... I hear people, say crazy things like, the amount of racism is still the same. It's just more subtle now. You're like, dude, stop. You know what I mean?
You're going to see what you look for, though.
Yeah,
this is my big problem. And I think the right question is, what does a healthy society celebrate? Like when a culture is doing well, what is it that they celebrate? And I actually loved your answer. The catch is that, to your point about all the deaths of despair, that young people, or young men specifically, the thing they most have to fear is themselves. But the question becomes, okay, why? You actually had a really cool quote. I'm not sure if this is verbatim or if I'm sort of ballparking this, but you said men need to feel some sense of power and usefulness in order to thrive. And I think that is indicative of what I see as happening in our society. So everybody has already heard this, but strong men make good times make weak men make hard times make strong men who make good times, and you loop around. And it's one of those, it's becoming trite because it's repeated so often because it is true. And so one of the most interesting things to look at is rich kids and why they so often implode. Not always, but a lot. And I think a big part of the reason is that there are algorithms running in our brain, evolutionarily placed, that nature, it really is red in tooth and claw. So going out and fighting for your survival was a real daily thing. For anybody who has not seen the show Alone, I highly encourage you to go watch that. You really get to see, even with like some modern tools, how hard it is to stay alive. Like it is brutal to get the calories, and to know that other things are looking at you as like, oh, your calories. So it was just gruelingly difficult. And then you had to worry about other humans and all this stuff. So anyway, nature had to hardwire you to get a very strong sense of positive emotion from doing hard things. And so when you have a society where the worst of us have air conditioning, refrigeration, a TV in multiple rooms usually, it's like, and those are the worst of us here in America, you end up disconcertingly creating this sense of like, wait, I didn't earn all the things that I have. And so I start feeling guilty. I want to help others. I see people struggling. I want to make things as easy for them as humanly possible. And because I have that same impulse, I know where it comes from. The problem is that as you start thinking about, I want to buy needles for people that are struggling with drugs. I want them to, look, it's hard to get people off. And so I want them to have dignity. And so I want to make sure they have clean needles. If they've put up a tent somewhere, I want to treat that as private property and that you can't just move them along. And so you get all of these really wonderful impulses that turned into policy become deranging.
Yes.
And so now all of a sudden, if you are only judging a policy by how it feels and not by the result that it actually yields, now you've got a problem. And of course, it's even more complicated than that. And you have some people with will to power and hey, I don't want my charity to go away. I actually want it to grow more powerful over time. And I'm not trying to work myself out of a job by making sure there are no homeless people.
It's a California problem.
Exactly.
Yep.
And so going back to that idea of, you need to judge everything based on the results, but you also need to decide what is it that we celebrate. And if people celebrated hard work, like, oh yeah, look, life is amazing, but you need to find a thing and do it. It needs to be hard. You need to push yourself. But if I want to piss off the internet, I would go right now and do the tweet that always winds people up. Hey, everybody, you need to work smart, you need to work hard, and you need to work long hours.
Yeah.
It is inevitable that I will get a just ton of people in my comments like, if I'm working hard and smart, why do I need to work long hours? And the reality is, because if you want to build something that really matters, you're going to go up against people that do all three. And that's just the reality. And you will lose every time you go up against somebody that's doing all three of those. Now, when It was hard as hell to get into this country, and people were coming from all over the world, escaping persecution, coming to the land of opportunity. We celebrated that shit. Like, we wanted you to build something. We were never Pollyanna. There has always been corruption. I get that, but I'm just saying it was just in the ether, man, that you celebrated people trying to build things and do things, and we wanted to cheer them on. And now, as somebody who's been here for almost 50 years, I see this slow shift away. Elon Musk captured this well. He was like, when did a billionaire become a pejorative?
Yes.
He was like, this used to be something that people celebrated.
Aspiration.
And yeah, like, dude, I had my head down for so long just trying to get rich, not having come from money, that by the time I picked my head up, I realized, oh, people think it's gross now. And I was like, wait, what? Like, I've worked so hard to build something that people want so much that they would rather have the thing that I've created than the money that it cost them. And I reaped the benefits of that in my own life. But bro, I was heads down solving problems that people wanted to solve. And it was grueling. And there was no promise that it was ever going to work out. And so when you start going, that's not worthy of celebration, it's like, be careful, because now all of a sudden what you're incentivizing is, in this case, we have come to celebrate victim mentality. The problem is, check the results. When you get celebrated for being a victim, it doesn't feel good. You're out of alignment with what I will call the evolutionarily placed algorithms running in your brain. And so now you've won, and you feel clout because I'm a bigger victim, and you feel righteous and that you have one over on people. And at the same time, you're doing drugs and you're dying deaths of despair, because it is just so out of alignment with a human animal that has come up over untold tens of thousands of years, depending on when you clock us as humans, probably hundreds of thousands of years, that it really was gruelingly difficult. And so that had to be neurologically rewarded. And so when you take that person and you celebrate them for, don't worry, you've been hard done by, the system is stacked against you, you shouldn't even try, like, just let us come in and nanny you and take care of you. And then the nannies feel good about being nannies and they perpetually want to keep people in that situation. Like, it deranges real fast. And I think people need only ask, what is my North Star? The things that you're doing, what outcome are they yielding? Things moving in the wrong direction. They feel good.
Yes.
They feel good. But they're just, the data is not good.
Yes.
This generation will be the first generation that lives less time than their parents. We have more homeless, at least in California, than in any time that I know of. More people dying from drug overdoses than any time. I mean, just on and on. Like, there's all these super gnarly metrics.
Man, you've talked about so much there. I have so many thoughts. I think the first thing that's important to say is that those angry, perhaps jealous and envious people and critical people who would leave mean comments on such a thing, they're a minority. And I think it's always important to remember that. Most people are aspirational, and actually the celebration of success, at least in the USA, is more common than the victim mentality or the billionaires bad, millionaires bad mentality. I know that there are people who have that, and there probably always will be some segment of the population with those views, and we'll get into that. But the vast majority of people still want to be successful, and they aspire and they are inspired by and motivated by people who achieve it, right? So you can push all the body positivity and fat acceptance you want, but people still look up to the guy or the gal who's clearly built an impressive physique and who is in good shape, and they still want to watch the Olympics, and they still want to watch sports and top tier athletes. And that's how we are, right? Human beings like heroes. We like aspirational stories. We like people who show us what we are capable of and what our potential is. Yes, is there a segment of the population that gets mad at that? That's their issue. Second thing I'd say with that is a lot of people who are in that latter category, a lot of it is just driven by envy and jealousy. That's the truth of it. And envy and jealousy are sins, and those are not emotions they're emotions that we all can occasionally feel, but you should transmute that into inspiration and motivation. Anytime I feel even the slightest pang of envy, like, it's almost imperceptible for me. I can't remember the last time I was like truly envious of someone, because I'm just motivated or inspired. If I see someone out there has done something or has something or has achieved something that I would like for myself in some way, or even if I don't, I just think it's cool, I'm a celebrator. I'm not a hater. I'm like, dude, that's awesome. Like, I love that. Like, I'm in the studio. I'm like, dude, the studio is cool. Like, I'd love to have a studio like this in the future. And so that's awesome. And I think this is happening on a bigger scale than ever now, just because we have the internet and social media. So I think the haters are hating harder than ever before, but the people who want to be inspired and motivated, gosh, it's never been easier to have mentors. Even just by clicking the follow button on someone, it's truly incredible. Like the fact that I'm, yesterday, I obviously had Elon Musk on my podcast last year, but the fact that I can just like message him, like we're chatting yesterday. I'm just like, I'm talking to freaking Elon Musk. Like what? Like this is crazy, right? Like you can just reach people. Wow, like I'm so inspired by this guy. I've been following this person for decades, whatever it is, and you can reach out to them and spread the knowledge and have conversations, and other people can tune in and listen. So in terms of, I do think that the reason why certain narratives that promote and encourage some form of victim mentality, the reason why they can be so powerful, I think it's multiple reasons. Normally there is some kernel of truth to them, right? So it normally takes a kernel of truth and then it just expands it and oftentimes creates an oppressor class, right? So everything you were saying about historical racism and discrimination in the USA, like that's all true. Okay. But also all the stuff we said about the progress that has been made and the opportunities that exist, regardless of your background and so on. All of that is also true. The idea that the game is rigged against you, I mean, it's true in a way. I mean, there are, look at the Fed and the money printing, like inflation, just that alone, just looking at like the money system and inflation and how that disproportionately affects particularly people who are of lower classes and don't have as much income and don't have as much assets. It's much, much harder on them than people who have a lot of assets and real estate and whatever. And so as inflation takes place, the value of their net worth actually is going up as other people are struggling to buy basic groceries. In that sense, you could say, yeah, actually the system, if by that you mean the monetary system and the way some of these politicians and bureaucrats move, yeah, actually that is rigged against kind of everybody to an extent. So there's some truth to it, but I think the reason why a lot of people latch onto it hard is because it gives a permanent alibi. This is why I've thought for a long time of why victim mentality is so appealing. And yes, I think people like having an enemy, but I also think people like having a permanent alibi and excuse for their absence of success. So if I fail or I don't succeed, or even if I behave badly, I could say, oh, this is because the system is biased against me in some way, shape, or form. It's not my issue and I don't need to take accountability because it's just the system. There's a narrative for this for people of different skin colors. There's a narrative of it for men. There's a narrative for women. There's a narrative for everybody. So anyone, no matter who you are, where you are, like there's a victim narrative that you can use. And some people will empathize with and sympathize with because there's that element of truth to it. And I think oftentimes people like to kind of like bond over how they're victims rather than in how they can achieve success and achieve victory. So with it all, I mean, the point I often make with people, because I get in a lot of these conversations, because I get a lot of pushback because I'm very sort of anti-victim mentality and I like to focus on the positive and optimism and the opportunities and the things that, not just why things are, okay, I'm a big fitness guy, okay? The obesity rate right now in the US is hovering around 40%, on track to hit 50% within about a decade. As it currently goes, you'll get to a point not so long in the future where literally 90% of the population is overweight or obese and only 10% are, of a healthy weight, in shape. And is it true that there's a lot of garbage that is in the American food system? Absolutely. And I can say that as someone who travels a lot, right? There's ingredients and chemicals and weird things that are put in here that are not put in the food in Europe or in Australia and so on. Is there just an abundance of cheap calories? Yes. Are certain healthy and nutritious foods getting more expensive? Yes, certainly per calorie. compared to, cheaper, less nutritious foods? Is there a lot of advertising and marketing and fast food joints on every corner and all of that? Yes, that is true. There are many things, are people living more sedentary lifestyles than ever before? Yes, there are many things working against people to stay physically healthy. I completely concede all those points. But with all of this stuff, Tom, it comes down to like, okay, well, what are you going to do about it? I don't have control over how much money the Bank of England or the Fed decides to print. I don't have influence over the advertising policies or which pharmaceuticals or foods are pushed and what's advertised. I don't have control over all of the other people and all the politicians in the system. At best, we have control over ourselves. And as we all know, that is hard in itself, right? Just controlling yourself and doing the things day to day, hour to hour that you're meant to be doing, that is a massive battle. So that's why I tend to focus on that, because it's internal versus external locus of control. I can talk to someone who's rants and raves about all of these different systems and historical issues and things happening right now that are making it harder for the average Joe or Jane to live and to thrive and so on. But it comes down to just, okay, so if I give you all that, what are you going to do? Are you going to just accept that and say, okay, for the next 50, 60, 70 years, I'm going to just give up, right? Or I'm just going to complain about it. I'm just going to tweet about it online and be angry and get mad at the people who managed to win? Or are you going to be like, okay, you know what? I'm in like the top 1% of privileged individuals who have ever walked this earth. Look, if you were born in the USA or the UK or another developed Western country, let's say in the past 70, 80 years, just that alone, you are massively privileged. Just having an American, just being an American citizen or being a British citizen. And then if you add on top of that being able-bodied, not having some, serious physical or mental disability, just that alone, you have a ridiculous number of advantages and quote unquote privileges compared to most people. I mean, to be in the top one, I know that obviously things, cost of living differs in different nations, of course. But I think to be in the top global 1% of income earners, you need to earn around $35,000 a year. So if you earn $35,000 or more per year, you are in the global 1% of income earners. 99% of the world's population earns under $35,000 a year. Most people don't know that, but just that alone.
Even if they know it, though, it's not going to change their sense of their day-to-day.
It doesn't. But the point is just having that perspective and being able to recognize, okay, I have issues. We have issues, the nation, the state, there are problems. But I think number one, it's like, okay, it could be way, 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 way worse. And it has been way worse in the past. And it is way worse in most countries around the world. So let's have you can simultaneously have gratitude and also want things to be better. Like these are not, it's not a dichotomy. Like they're not mutually exclusive.
I think let me take a swing at this. Tell me what you think about this. All right. There are 3 doors before you. Door number 1 is victimhood. By all means, walk through it, and it has its pluses and minuses. Door number 2 is the path of individual self-improvement. Door number 3 is swaying culture. Mm-hmm. Do you see those as 3 valid doors, or because what you've been talking about now is where I spent 99.999% of my life and can feel myself going through a transition where I previously, in fact, if you go back far enough, 7 years ago, I said, and this is going to be very close to a quote, I don't focus on the culture or society. I focus on the individual. I just want to do me, and I'm going to get as good as I can get. Boos don't block dunks. I can do anything I want, whether the deck is stacked against me, whether I'm a victim, it's all irrelevant. I can get so good I can't be stopped. Mm-hmm. And I spent a ton of my life there. Now I'm beginning to realize I can sway culture. And I have an operating system that tells me that ideas matter, that you can influence what ideas people hold. And if they change the ideas that the way I really think about it is those ideas are beliefs or values, which is why I started this conversation of values. If you can change what people value and what they believe, then you change their entire frame of reference. Their frame of reference controls their outcome. So then I go, there's a lot of weird shit going on. This moment feels particularly interesting. Now, one of two things is possible. Either we really are in the West living in a transitional moment, or we're not. And as you approach 50, no matter what, you just start thinking you are. Because, the kids today, right? Like they see things so differently. You stop feeling like you recognize the world. That began to happen to me in my mid 40s. So it's entirely possible that's an illusion that just happens to everybody in their mid 40s to 50s, that the world now is just so different from when you were a kid. You can't help but think, whoa, like you wake up to this sense of maybe I should try to have influence in the world. But I actually think that while that's true, the predominant thing is this really is a transitional moment that is very reminiscent of the 60s. And so just perfect storm, money printing, which is something hopefully we'll have time to talk about, is playing a huge part in this. The kids' futures have been stolen from them. They can feel that. And I'm finally now at a position where I can actually articulate, I know exactly how your future was stolen from you, which is really terrifying.
Yes.
It's terrifying because it happened in broad daylight, but because people don't understand the way the world works, and it takes a very long time. So the whole thesis of my show is you can think of it as an unbiased pursuit of the truth. You can think of it as debating the world's most important ideas. You can think of it as mapping great thinkers' minds so that you can use them as your own AI. At the end of the day, I need to understand how the world really works, not so I can cry about it, so that I walk through the right of those three doors. Now, I hope every word out of my mouth and everything about my life tells people to slam door number one shut. Don't fucking waste your time being a victim. You will literally die a death of despair. I don't mean that figuratively. I mean that literally. Door number two is awesome, but I have a growing hypothesis that door number two merely prepares you for door number three. Now, door number three for most people is probably just the family. But once you understand that the family, so you've got the dyad, which is the first moment where you're like, oh, my significant other is a life outside of me that I care about. Then you have kids. Full disclosure, anybody who's followed me for a while knows I don't have kids, but I get that this is the first real complete unit of the grander structure that is society. And so doing that well is very wise. But there is also just a scale up from that, which is to really try to influence culture in the hope that at least in your, I'll use country as a stand-in, at least your country, you can impact things in a way that will make life better for people. Now, all you're really trying to do is sway that frame of reference.
Yes.
So I'm trying to celebrate things that alter your value system. I'm trying to hold quote unquote facts, which we could derail on that, but you're trying to sway people's understanding of the facts to be checked against reality, the very first thing that you said here, so that the things they do don't just sound good on paper, they actually work. But if I'm right about all of that, and as soon as I stop talking in 9 seconds, you'll tell me, if I'm right about that, then we have to understand how the world really works. And I believe we now live in the age of conspiracy. And I believe that people doing dumb shit has earned that. All right, I'm going to stop there. I first want to get your read on the three doors.
Sure thing. Well, I was thinking that, doors 2 and 3 are not mutually exclusive.
Agreed.
I think you want to walk through both of them. And I think that the further you walk through the second door, oftentimes the more impact you can have when you do walk through the third one, because you can't pour water from an empty jug. So if you have not done anything to reach your own potential, then number one, you don't have much to teach, and you don't have a lot of resources, if any, to give, be that time or money or experience or knowledge. You have to go on, you have to develop yourself individually as a person in order to have any type of positive cultural impact. If you and I had not done any type of self-improvement or education or knowledge or achieved any type of success in any field, well, firstly, why would anyone listen to this podcast, right? The podcast wouldn't be possible to begin with. But by doing that, you then gain the leverage to help other people in different ways. The way you shift culture can look very different for different people, right? You don't need to be a wealthy person or materially successful necessarily. There are people who, they earn a very modest living and they're out there, but, they've raised 8 kids and they have 30 grandkids and they're a pillar in their community and they're just a good, solid person who people look up to and they're like, hey, I want to be like that guy. That guy's gonna, he knows his stuff and he can pass on knowledge to his children and his grandchildren and so on. And he's just making that type of impact. And then there can be someone else who's a wealthy philanthropist and they're, donating to genuine causes that are helping to move the needle, especially in areas where the government or the state is not helping out. And they're, hey, I'm going to build a school or I'm going to do this or I'm going to do that. But you can't do any of that unless you walk through that second door, because you have to achieve something first. And also the more you achieve, as I've said before, human beings are aspirational. So the more you achieve in that door, other people see it. Other people see it and they are, all human beings we're all followers to some degree. Some people flip between, if you are a leader, you still flip between leading sometimes and following sometimes. Some people are more in the following role, but we all look for leaders. We all look for individuals who show us. I mean, our parents are the first version of that in most cases, where it's like, okay, like what do I model myself after? How do I live my life? So yeah, I think doors 2 and 3. Yeah, I'm with you. Close door 1 shut and keep it shut. And yeah, 2 and 3 as you proceed through your life. I don't even think they're concurrent doors. I think you continue to self-improve and to better yourself and improve yourself and fulfill your potential. And at the same time, you have that community or cultural impact. For some people, like I said, it's going to be for a small minority of people, it's going to be in a massive way. Elon Musk, right? It's going to be whoa, okay, this guy's he's trying to make us a multi-planetary species, right? Like kind of hard to go bigger than that. But it doesn't need to be on that level. And it doesn't need to be so public for everyone, right? Most of the good that exists in the world, I would say, is done in private. And it might not get a lot of shine. It might not go viral on social media or make the news or anything like that. But there's just that day-to-day good. And by the way, this is one of the things that, we were talking a lot about the darkness of humanity. And this is one of the things that makes me like a permanent optimist and a genuine lover of human beings. And this is those just unseen, unheard, day-to-day interactions and pleasantries. When I come across someone who really thinks like the whole world is falling apart or the country is falling apart and, there's going to be a civil war in 6 months and, everything's going crazy and this and that. And, there's going to be a race war and this and that. And, men and women are just hating each other. And I'm always like, firstly, get offline, right? Like go outside, like go into any city, walk around LA, walk around London, walk around New York, walk around Dallas, Miami, whatever. Does this look to you like everyone is hating each other and the left and the right are beating each other up and there's a civil war impending and black and white people can't get on, whatever? Like just look around, like people are doing all right. And this goes for other countries as well. Right? In most nations, maybe unless you go literally into a war zone, things are generally looking pretty good. And I think it's important to not get, there's something interesting I've noticed over the past few years, which is that, I think when people think of dopamine or think of things that are addictive, they tend to think of something that is giving someone like a positive feel. And I think it's often forgotten that you can get that from negativity as well. You can really get addicted to fear narratives and anger narratives and outrage.
Way
and just
easier.
Yes.
Way easier.
Yeah, it's very addictive. And I think people forget that and they get locked into this loop and they don't realize like how much they're enjoying telling themselves this narrative that it's all falling apart and it's all crumbling and
Here's the thing though, because you're right, and I love that you're optimistic, and I worry sometimes that people don't understand that my default position is optimism. However, I'll keep coming back to my hypothesis. And if I'm wrong, just tell me how.
Sure, go ahead.
But my hypothesis is this: none of that happens by accident. The very reason that when you go walk around the city, you meet incredible people is that people are paranoid. That some people are like, hey, I'm worried about a race riot, whatever, which PS 2020 from my balcony, you could literally watch LA burn during the riots. So it actually happened. Like there was real violence. And we have gone backwards in race relations, as far as I can tell, from when I was a kid until now. We've moved backwards.
Yes.
So now I'm like, oh shit, like this is not a one-way arrow where everything just automatically gets better. This is about the battle of ideas, and the fight for culture.
To be frank, it was progressives that did that. People who call themselves progressive. That did not come from the right.
I will aggressively agree with that. Look, both sides have their delusions, and my whole thing is you need dynamic tension. I've given that speech so many times, but nonetheless, things will move in a bad direction, and they will go all the way to hundreds of millions of people dying. And so that is history tells me so. That is not me guessing. Just history tells me so. And hey, by the way, everybody, there are very credible people who are like, Europe is already in the middle of World War III. It just hasn't managed to work its way through the escalation complex yet. It will, and we will very rapidly see that this doesn't stop. It just takes time to work through the system. Now, I'm not deterministic. I'm deterministic. I don't think that's the necessary end.
Yes.
Not to confuse anybody. But it won't happen. Avoiding that won't happen by accident. People are going to have to make the right decisions. Culture will not automatically move in the right direction. People have to make the right decisions. Ray Dalio, who I think is one of the greatest living thinkers, certainly economically, but I think he has succeeded in economics precisely because he understands human psychology. And he really gets this idea that everything is about how people treat each other, and that these ideas can very rapidly fall off the rails, and that you have to find ways to bring people back on. And so what I want to see people do is that, to understand and engage with, okay, you need to find love. You need to fill your heart with love. This is what I always tell people. Don't go into a fight to be right. Fill your heart with love. Figure out how you bring people back together, but understand that you really are going to have to fight for these ideas.
Yes. Well, Tom, this is why I think the work you do is important. This is why I think the work that I do is important. Just by having these conversations and beaming it out to hundreds of thousands or even millions of people, it helps to maintain sanity. The most common thing that people say to me, if I get recognized in public anywhere in the world, whatever city, whatever country, one of the most common things that people say to me is, you help me to stay sane. Thank you for helping me just stay sane. I was going through this period, whether it was the pandemic area or it was just whatever it might be, socio-cultural. They're just like, you're just a sane voice that is like a pillar for me, because there's so much inflammatory, angry, hostile stuff out there. And sadly, our so-called leaders have not been doing a great job of demonstrating how people can disagree civilly, how to articulate an argument, how to empathize with different positions and listen and not result to insults and ad hominem and all of those things. It's falling on, I would just say, like an army of normal, decent people. And that army is growing, particularly through the power of social media and podcasting. We're now all able to, do you know how many guests you've had on this podcast?
We're closing in on 1,000 episodes.
Okay.
Not all of those are unique guests, but call it 800.
800. Okay. So if you just think of like the network effect of that, and you think of all the different podcasters, you've obviously got Joe Rogan out there who's, got this giant, but all of these independent, you could call it independent media, all of these voices. And then you add in X or Twitter, you add in Instagram, you add in Facebook, all these different platforms. If you look at mainstream media, legacy media, like in terms of news media, like it's declining, even in terms of Hollywood and all these things that have been these legacy institutions for our entire lives and before it. in terms of viewership, in terms of audience, in terms of trust, they're generally declining. And all of this long tail of independent media is bubbling up and people trust it more. Because whether or not you agree with someone, so someone can be listening to this whole conversation. There'll be people who generally agree more with you on certain things, people who generally agree more with me on certain things, or, it's just some mix, but we're both acting in good faith. You're not trying to misrepresent me. I'm not trying to misrepresent you. We're trying to understand each other, play through different ideas. And you do this over the course of 1,000 different conversations, which are then heard by millions of people. And it's important because you're not just discussing the ideas, but you're also demonstrating the process. I often hear people saying like, oh, it's like impossible to have conversations these days, or like, how do I do? And I'm like, if you act in good faith, no matter how much two people disagree, as long as they are acting in good faith and they're not trying to like straw man or undermine the other person or try to stick a nasty label on them or whatever, as long as they're just acting in good faith and genuinely trying to understand each other. Well, number one, if people are talking, they're not fighting. And I always say there's only 3 ways to solve any conflict: discussion and diplomacy, separation, segregation, divorce, or physical violence. Those are only 3 options. So I'm a huge fan of the first one. As long as people are having conversations and debates and they're discussing ideas and having conversations, then they're not physically at war with each other on any scale. So this is one reason why I'm a massive advocate for freedom of speech, even if sometimes it can make people uncomfortable, because it's like, well, as long as people are talking and they're discussing the ideas and chopping through them, I do believe that the best ideas float to the top. Why do you think that when people are pushing terrible ideas, whatever side that's coming from, why do they rely on censorship? Good ideas don't need to be protected via censorship. Good ideas can be challenged. If something is a good idea, it can stand up to challenge. It can stand up to scrutiny. It's not afraid. People aren't afraid to debate it. When people are on like super dodgy territory, or when they're pushing something that is antisocial or genuinely harmful, because it's like, okay, we need to ram this through and censor anybody who takes any type of issue with it. That's when that should be like a massive warning sign to people, right? Mm-hmm. If you look historically, the censors aren't the good guys. The people relying on censorship, they're not the good guys. So, I'm optimistic because I think that this is just a breakthrough time in humanity. I mean, through the power of this technology, for as much issues and problems as social media has caused to people, which I think people are also starting to wake up to now and starting to get a better understanding of how to manage it more. Despite all of those issues, it's fundamentally changed the way we communicate permanently. And I think we're still extremely early in that. I don't know exactly what it looks like, but the world is smaller than it's ever been. I was just in Canada yesterday. I did an event there over the last couple of days, and it's my first time in Canada in 20-something years, first time going there for career reasons. And, on paper, I knew that I had like fans and some type of audience in Canada, but just to be there in like, Victoria, British Columbia, which is like a pretty like woke part of Canada, and I meet like hundreds of people who are like, want to meet me and hug me and like, man, like you're this and this and this, and I'm like, gosh, like I live in Dubai, and same thing kind of happens there. It's like it's global. People are listening to this podcast from 100+ different countries, and that's magic to me. That's almost like magic to me. Like this has never existed before. The audience that you have is no historic leader had a global audience even close to this before. Maybe like the Queen of England or something. But this is just totally new. It's amazing. I meet people in different parts of the world who have learned English from listening to podcasts like this. Like that's how they learned English. Hey, I wanted to understand Jordan Peterson, so I learned English. Like I told Joe Rogan this, that when I last time I was like, Joe, I've met multiple people in different parts of the world who learned English by listening to your podcast.
You're going to speak very different English if you learn from Joe and you learn from Jordan.
But just like that, just the fact that can happen is amazing. And that genie's not going back in the bottle.
I agree with you on all that. Let me ask you a sort of wolves howling in the background conversation starter here. as I've researched more world history, as I've started looking at events that are happening now, I really do think that we've entered the age of conspiracy. And I say that in a very specific way. COVID gave me a thread to pull on because I never thought about living in an age of conspiracy. It just never really made my radar. I assumed the government had my best interest at heart. I thought that inflation, I literally thought this, I thought inflation was just a natural law of nature. That just happened to money. I never thought about why. I just thought that that's what happened.
That's why we need to fix the schools, man.
And for a whole host of other reasons, but yes. And now the more I look at this, the more I realize, oh, wow, like we're being manipulated left, right, and center. And the manipulation, as far as I can tell, is two things, both more in public and therefore ripe to be dismantled, and accelerating, because social media doesn't just allow us to reach out to people. Until Elon exposed what was going on with social media via the Twitter files, it also allowed the government to literally just open a pipeline. RFK is talking about this a ton. 72 hours after Biden took office, he opened a portal into the major social media companies to give the government access to get blocked what they want to block. That's insane. AI is being trained. I mean, we all saw it like when it got ridiculous with Google Gemini, where George Washington is black Nazis, like just absolutely crazy. But again, that's manipulation where it suddenly spills over and you see, but you suddenly realize, whoa, like I'm being manipulated all over the place. Okay. So the reason that you first made my radar and the reason that I wanted to have you on the show is when you start peeling the onion back and you realize all of these things really are true. There really are conspiracies. Not that every conspiracy is true, but there really are conspiracies. There are really people in the government trying to manipulate you. There are really corruptions within the government in the US, everywhere. So you start seeing all this stuff is true. Now, you are able to have an open mind and not have your brain fall out. But you're also very able to be early on very contrarian thinking. So BLM comes out and you're just like, this is a grift, hard. I'm just going to tell you right away. And
dude, the amount of flack I got from that.
Well, so what I want to understand though is what rubric are you using to think through these problems so that you don't get swept away in cultural energy? Because what happens to most people is they get swept away in cultural energy. And therefore, if I'm trying to manipulate people, I need only sway public opinion. This is why they want to censor, because people are actually very easy to sway at the level of culture if their voice goes unchallenged. So how do you navigate that? Knowing some people are trying to manipulate me, but there is some way that you use to find what is true without just going, everything's a lie.
I think it's always hard to answer questions about ourselves because, I only know so much about myself. So I don't know why I do all the things I do and why I believe all the things I do.
Startlingly true answer for all of us.
Yeah. So I think one part of it is my personality type. So I am extremely low in neuroticism. I did it, the Big 5 personality test. I actually did Jordan Peterson's one, and I came out in the one percentile of neuroticism, meaning like 99% of people are more sensitive to negative emotion than me. This includes fear, this includes sadness, depression, worry, all these types of things. So all through my life, when other people panic or get scared or super worried or anxious about something, I always tend to be like, just in terms of my wiring, I'm calm. I'm calm in the storm. I'm calm in the fire. So I don't know, that fight or flight response kind of thing, maybe for me, it's just not as, it doesn't kick in the way it other people does. And, a lot of people, like, they're very easy to emotionally hijack, right? You scare them or you upset them or you anger them and they raise their voice. They're angry, they're shouting, they're screaming, or, they're sad, they're crying. I'm just like, it can be quite hard to even tell if I'm always happy, but even if I was sad, people would still think I'm happy because I just don't really change that much. So I think that's a factor. So my emotions are just kept in check. And on top of that, I just tend to think sort of rationally and logically. I'm also very solutions oriented. So I tend not to be like, oh my gosh, this is bad, I'm angry. My brain immediately tends to go, okay, what's the way through this? What's the best course of action? What's the solution? So that is definitely, I think that's a core part of it. I'm very intellectually curious as well. And I don't tie my identity totally in my beliefs. So you or someone else can challenge my beliefs or question them, or someone can even ridicule them. And again, a lot of people have no separation between their beliefs and their ideas and their identity. And I think with that, their self-esteem and their self-worth, which is why if you challenge or criticize an idea that they have, they take it extremely personally and they very quickly get angry. Sometimes there's people who will, as you said, will get violent over that, because to them that you're attacking me. You're not attacking my belief, you're attacking me. And I've somehow managed to disassociate those things to some degree, even for beliefs that are very important and integral to me. I just don't take it that personally. So I think that helps because I can see things kind of more clearly and try to understand from a different side. And I genuinely want to. Another point is that I don't have an agenda. There's a lot of people out there who are like, I see these like actual conspiracy theorists on the internet, and they're, trying to work out like, what's my agenda? What's my angle? What side am I? Who am I funded by? Which, what grift am I pulling or whatever? It's like none. Like, I want to know what's true. I'm not I'm certainly not funded by some organization. I'm not part of some Illuminati, or I'm not a Freemason or whatever people think. And I just want to know I just want to know the truth. I'm not trying to, there are people when something happens, they're immediately thinking, how do I use this to ram down my ideology? I'll tell you a great example when you always see this happen. Any high profile shooting takes place in the USA. Immediately, before the bodies are even warm, you have the hardcore left-wing anti-gun gun control, but like they're not even thinking about the victims, or like they're just immediately politics, but like how can we ram down? Let's use this moment. BLM, great example. This is a flashpoint. Yes, this horrible thing. Yes, let's immediately use this to ram down our political ideology, right? And then you can have that on the inverse, depending on what the situation is. So these are not people who like really want to know what's true. They don't know that, did George Floyd die because of racism? Did he die because of drugs? Did he die because of police misconduct? They don't care, right? It was a black man died, white police officer, boom. That's our narrative. Ram it down the people. So these are not honest actors. They're too ideological. They're activists, right? I'm not like that. I don't have in many of these things, I don't have a dog in the fight, because sometimes it's not even my country. I'm not an American, for example. But I just want to know what is true. Like what's the truth here? What happened? And so I tend to respond slower. Something happens and I'm not like, oh, let me give my hot take on Twitter right now. It's just like, ooh, okay, what's happening here? Let's see this play out, right? Sometimes you even hear a video snippet, or you see something and it's like, okay, well, what was the full context of it? Some people will just hear that snippet, jump on it, react to it, boom, it like spread it all over the place now. And then it turns out 2 days later that actually what was said was quite different to what people understood. So I think some of that is just, again, I don't have an agenda. So that certainly helps. And then I will honestly say the last one is, how would I put it? I think it does tie back to what we were talking about initially, which is faith. Because faith practically does a few things for me. Number one is that it snuffs out a lot of fear. There's a lot of people who have a lot of fear that I don't have, because I tell people like, I fear God, I don't fear man. So if there's something that, I believe is truthful, but I'm like, oh, it might upset some people, or I might get some backlash, or someone might leave a nasty comment or something. I'm like, I don't care, right? If it's like, hey, this is true, or like it's true and it needs to be said, like there's an importance in saying this thing, then I just put that out there. And as long as I feel like I believe that, yeah, that is something that it's good and it's righteous. And again, I'm not lying. I'm not pushing some agenda or anything like that. Then, okay, like there it goes. So I think that combination of things for me personally. Oh, and I'd say the last thing as well is perhaps just, maybe the last thing is just a level of humility, where I understand that I can be wrong. And I'm not afraid to say that. I find a lot of people are like afraid of the idea that they even could be wrong. And I'm not. Like when I do a podcast or even when I tweet, like it's very stream of consciousness. I'm thinking through these answers as I'm talking. You know, you ask me a question or we're bouncing ideas, and some of the ideas are better formed than others because some of them I've really thought about and perhaps even articulated before. Whereas other things like what I'm answering right now, I'm like, that's a good question. I don't really know. Let me think to myself, what are the personality traits or frameworks that I use to try to get to the truth and try to stay calm in the storm. And so, yeah, I think that's a combination. The willingness to say, hey, this is what I think. I could be wrong. I'm willing to update. I'm open to challenge, which is why I've never, I've been on Twitter for 15 years. I have not once ever blocked off the comments or not allowed people to go nope, come at me, right? I'm putting this idea out here. Let's test it, right? People can, sometimes I put one out there and that's interesting feedback, whatever the case may be. But it's just okay, cool. I can learn. And I also want to know not just what I think, but I'm very curious as to what other people think, because we all have different frameworks and we all have different angles and perspectives. And truth is an interesting thing.
What do you mean by that?
What I mean is that multiple things can be true at once, and things can be true from different angles. And I think oftentimes in conversation and lots of these cultural and political conversations, for whatever reason, maybe I do have a reason. I think I might know the reason, but people get locked into binaries very often, as in it's either that one or it's either that one. And people act like there's no middle, or that two things can't be true at once. And I don't know if this is just like a cognitive flaw that people have or something, where they struggle to understand that, okay, that can be true, but that can also be true, right? It can be true that the food industry and big pharma and the advertising industry are, putting profits over people, and they're using dodgy advertising and too many chemicals, and they're poisoning your food and right? That whole narrative, that can be true. It can also be true that, hey, buddy, you're fat because you don't exercise at all and you're eating way too many calories compared to the amount that you're burning, and your lifestyle is the reason why you are so overweight. They can both be true, right? Someone will just be like, no, it's not that. It's not that person's fault at all. It's all the food company. It's like, well, how come any American is in shape then? If it were just the food company, theoretically, every single person in the country would be overweight. No one would be jacked. No one would be, that's clearly not the case. So yeah, there is personal responsibility in here. There is accountability, right? There are things that you can control. You could say, hey, this thing is getting harder. Okay, so someone could say, hey, it's getting harder to buy a property. The prices are outrunning the wages. This is happening. Does that mean that a person should not aspire to ever buy a property? Someone who wants one, who wants to have a home, should they just say, oh, well, the game is rigged against me, and there's inflation, and there's this? That can all be true. But it's also well, yeah, but there's things you can do to still win. And coming back, this circles around back to the idea of despair. I think one of the reasons for a lot of the despair that's happening in our nations is, I think some of it is I think the game is and always has been rigged to some degree and always will be. I think some of the over-rigging of it, or some of the downstream effects of that, are one of the reasons for the despair. And then I think on top of it, I think when you put the victim mentality on top of it, that's like a double dose of despair. It's yeah, things are getting harder in certain ways. Oh, and also, by the way, there's nothing you can do about it. So why don't you just drink yourself and drug yourself into oblivion? There are other factors, of course. You can talk about this issue from multiple angles. I do think that for men in particular, one of the challenges that people are having in the modern West, and perhaps across just developed countries, I wouldn't be surprised if this is also true in maybe places like Japan or South Korea or something, is I think the role of a man and the role of masculinity has never been less clear. So people can say what they like, good or bad, about so-called gender roles, but for most of human history, And still in many parts of the world, it's clear. Okay, so someone might think like that is good or bad. Like 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 500 years ago, people weren't saying, okay, what does, you have a young boy, you have a young girl or woman. There wasn't a big debate and confusion around, okay, like what should you do? What should be your general course of life? What should you aspire towards? What should you do? It was pretty clear. Okay, you're a boy, you're a young man. Cool. You do this, you protect, you provide, you learn a skill, you get a job, you earn enough money, you get married, you have kids, you look after them, you raise your family, You're a woman, cool. You learn certain skills, you become a mother, you get married, you become a mother, you have children, you raise those children, you look after their home, you help with various tasks and so on. And so it was very clear. It was just very clear. So some people will take issue with that and say, there wasn't enough flexibility and, what about the exceptional people who wanted I understand all that, but it was clear. And I think now, in one of the first places and in one of probably the first time in human history, it's just not that clear, I think, to a lot of young men. If you take like a guy between 14 and 25, it's just not that clear like what they're meant to do in a way that it used to always be clear. It's like, yeah, you can still do the traditional path and strive to become a protector and a provider, learn a skill, get married. I'd still say, hey, like, those conservative quote unquote ideas, that still generally works. But also it's harder in many ways that are not your fault, right? You've just inherited this weird economic situation and you're now living in a time where actually even the idea of, hey, you do these things and you'll find a decent wife, that's not as much of a given. And then there's a whole flip side of this for young women where it's like, well, am I supposed to depend on a man or not? Am I meant to be independent or dependent? There's this weird thing that's been going on, which is causing quite a lot of conflict between the two sexes, which neither really seems to be that happy with. It's like on paper, there's more choice than ever before on paper, but in a strange paradoxical way, the impacts of that increased choice that came decades ago has also managed to now constrain and confine people. Because let's say a young man and women want to do the more traditional route again. Now it's really hard to raise. Now it's really hard to just have a single income unless the guy's like really, really crushing it at his work or his business. That's just way harder now than it used to be. It's harder to buy a property. It's harder to do this and that. So there's people who even have that more sort of traditional conservative mindset and approach towards it. And even for them, it's just like, whoa, this is a lot harder to do than it was.
What do modern people do, given that they are facing these extra challenges?
Yeah.
What do they do?
It's a great question, man. I know with you and Michael Malice, you had the whole thing of like, the should versus the ought. It's tricky, because people don't like being told what to do. That seems to be like a great sin.
True, but you have a North Star, right? And
I do have a North Star.
Is human flourishing.
I do think that most people should still do the normal stuff, the normal route. I think that both men and women, biologically, physiologically, mentally, we have a certain hardwiring where men generally we still want to be useful. We want to be respected. We like to create additional resources more than we just need as independent, solo men, so that we can provide and help others, wife, family, children, maybe community. If we have a certain amount of success, we're still very much wired that way. The vast majority of women in every single country, they still want to become mothers. They still want to get married. They still want to have children. They still actually, even if you poll working women, the majority of them, even in Western countries, when answering anonymously, if asked, hey, if you had the opportunity to stay home and raise your children, would you take it? Like if financially you weren't stressed on that front, majority actually say yes. So as much as we supposedly break away from these sort of gender roles and expectations, it's so ingrained in people that it hasn't really changed. We're stuck in this weird place between traditionalism and chivalry versus sort of progressivism and egalitarianism. And I think that causes a lot of confusion. I think especially for young people, it really causes a lot of confusion for them because say for a young man, okay, I don't know, you're taking a girl out on a date. Like the expectations are kind of weird because there's all this feminism and egalitarianism and men and women are just the same. And, all da. In fact, in terms of unmarried people under the age of 30 in a lot of cities, actually women are now out earning men and women are getting more degrees and so on and so forth. But the woman still expects the man to pay. And the man
Also,
still thinks
hypergamy is still real.
Yes. And the man still thinks, hey, like I should pay for the date. And then, but like, if you had true egalitarianism, that doesn't really necessarily make sense. But like men are still considered the ones who are meant to approach and the ones who are supposed to pursue and the ones who are meant to pay and protect and provide. Even like a woman who might call herself a feminist, she still has a lot of these expectations in many cases. And there's this weird, it can be quite a deranging thing for someone to navigate this like ping pong back and forth between, wait, I thought it was like this, but then the expectations here. And I think
what do they do?
There's a lot of disappointment. Hey, I'm kind of a return to tradition guy, but I think people have to find their way. I also think when it comes to, when you ask that, are you asking about like the sort of male-female dynamic or just broadly?
Yeah, I'm super curious. So the way that I approach life is there are very real answers. Now, admittedly, there are times where I haven't been in a given situation. Like I can't tell you what to do in a dating app because I've never been on one, but I can tell you how to think through a dating app.
Sure.
So what I'm looking for, it just goes back to this idea of, okay, I've got this incredibly powerful flesh-based AI in front of me. How does he tackle these given problems? So by way of model of what I'm looking for, my response in all of this is, okay, things have gotten harder for you. I agree with you. The way I say it is you want to align with your biology. So dear women, now this is a guy who's married to a woman that does not want kids. But trust me, that was a long conversation about why and how it is that she would be the exception and is she sure and all that stuff.
You just said something there that's extremely important, which is to recognize that that is an exception.
For sure.
I think in our societies, what's happened too much recently is things are being built around the exceptions rather than the common case. And so at the sake of allowing the exceptions to flourish and thrive, you've oftentimes crushed the majority, perhaps in ways that you didn't anticipate.
For
Does
sure.
that make sense?
Oh, very much so.
Okay.
And I think Thomas Sowell is going to make another appearance here. There are no solutions. There's only trade-offs. And so understanding that, you want to fight for the people that are being marginalized.
Yes.
The problem is when you swing all of culture and aim it at protecting the marginalized, you just now trampled on all the people that were like, whoa, I perfectly aligned with the sort of evolutionarily validated way of doing it. But now culture is not aligned to that. So you've got the bulk of people that when they align with their biology now feel out of step with culture. And I think we're coming out of that and we're going to be on the other side of that. And I think it's going to re-swing a bit more traditional and women are going to be greeted with open arms and celebration again. This goes back to what do you celebrate as a culture? My wife was once talking to a woman and the woman was asking my wife what she did and, all these cool accolades, companies, money, success. And my wife was like, oh, what do you do? And she's like, I'm just a mother. And my wife was like, hold on, time out. You're doing the world's greatest thing. There is nothing more honorable and beautiful than having kids. But society has told you to add just in front of that. She was like, no way. Like, that's so amazing. And so anyway, my wife, even though it's not her past, she understands that the vast majority of humanity falls into that bucket and that we need to celebrate that. And those, when I meet parents, 9 times out of 10, I thank them for their service.
I love it.
Because, and I'm not being tongue in cheek, I really mean it. I have chosen not to have kids and I am somebody who wants to see humanity move forward. And so in many ways, I am accepting the kindness of strangers who've chosen a different path. And so therefore, this is not the movie, The Future of Man. I can't remember if that's the title.
Oh, Children of Men?
Children of Men, thank you. About a world that has no more kids. And it's just a desolate, horrible place. And I think that it would be horrible. So anyway, I think that people need to understand, yes, you were trying to do something good, but the outcome was terrible. This has become the theme of the episode from my side of the table. is that. And how do we accurately assess when things are going awry?
Yes.
And so if we were to set the table for all the things that have broken, or, a top handful, for people today, you've said it's harder.
Yes.
You've already laid one thing on the table, which is the relationship between the sexes has become obsessed with the people that are at the fringes, like
I can answer
my
that.
wife.
Can I answer that one?
Please.
So I'm going to speak to individuals here because I can't really speak to a group. So I'm going to frame the question as, what would be my general broad advice for a young man or a young woman in this society today who's bombarded with all this stuff and who's kind of worried about it. I think the first thing I'd say is become truly self-aware. And when I say that, what I mean is for your whole life, you're influenced by your parents, your family, your community, your culture, wherever you grow up, and we're all influenced by all these things. And all these things and people also tell us what you should do and what you should want. And so I think it's important to take a pause and think about what your actual priorities are and be truly honest. Be truly honest about this. If you're a young woman and you're like, you know what, like I'm not interested in like working a job for decades and this, and actually I'd love to like get married and have ideally a bunch of kids and just raise that, and like be honest with yourself and recognize that is, firstly, that's like like that's totally like normal and it's good and there's nothing like denigrating about it, because people have really been, it's weird because there's this idea of choice, but at the same time some of the most like normal and traditional choices are like frowned upon or shamed or attacked. There's so many women who feel like afraid to kind of say, hey, I kind of just want to be a wife or a mother, or like I am just a wife and a mother, just. And it's like, wait, why is that the case? So I think people need to be honest with that. And I'd say another core part of self-awareness, I think I once had a tweet where I said this. I said, self-awareness is knowing when you're the rule and knowing when you're the exception.
That's nice.
Yeah. So really look at yourself and your personality and your proclivities and the things you want and the things you don't want, and recognize like in most things, you're going to be the norm, right? Like most of us don't have such extreme personalities and desires that we're going to be the exception in everything. Most people will be the norm in most things, and you might be the exception in a few. So norms, yeah, lo and behold, whether you're talking about men or women, actually most men want to protect and provide to some degree. Most men want to be respected in their community and by their, future spouse and their children. So most men actually want to get married and have children. Most women want to get married and have children. Most people want, most men would like to have a career. Do most women want to have a traditional career? I don't know, but whatever the thing, but know where you're the norm, know where you're the exception. Okay. So and then when you're the norm, look at people who you aspire towards, who have done the normal thing in this regard, and model it, right? So if you're, I do want to get married and I do want to have kids. I do want, like, you've got billions of examples around the world of people who did those exact things. And you can look at people who did it well and people who did it badly, and you can learn from them and say, oh, okay, I saw the steps that this person took, and I can even speak to these individuals and so on. And so cool. In this aspect of life, that's my trajectory. That's my general path. That's typically what I want. And then you look at the other areas and you balance it out, and you will have some things where you might be an exception. Okay. So most people aren't going to start a company, for example. Most people are not entrepreneurs. Being an entrepreneur is an exception. So if you're not, there's nothing wrong with not being an entrepreneur. Right. So for most people, it's going to be like, okay, I need a job of some sort, right? Like I need to be employed because I'm not going to go and start a whole company. And so, cool, I'm going to do that. And then I'm going to get a job. In terms of exactly what that is, again, you can do more self-reflection and education and work out, okay, cool, this is the thing I want to do. It's the thing I'm good at. And it's the thing that there's a market demand for. And so you can go into that. So I think with both young men and young women, I think just being truly, truly honest about your desires and your ranking of them, of the things you want to prioritize, and understanding, I think on top of that, that this is going to change over the course of your life. So consider that, right? If you're 22 years old and you're like, yeah, I never want to have kids, take caution there, right? Like,
Don't get a vasectomy
right,
just yet. Yeah.
Right? Like maybe, you'll never change on that, right? Maybe all through those next decades, you'll never change. But like to know that for certain at 22, like you need an extreme level of like self-awareness and ability to protect, which most people just don't really have, to be honest. So recognize, cool, like you have these things and it's going to change over the course of time, and it should. And then, yeah, I think just take steps towards those things, and don't allow the culture, especially if you think the culture is degenerate, don't allow the culture or society or the media or whatever to like push and shove you totally against your values and your goals just so you can fit in, or so that people you don't care about will like you, or whatever the case may be. Just, do that. And on top of that all, enjoy the process. And I think that's really what it is. I'd say one more thing between like men and women in particular is, because I see a lot of like the dating discourse and stuff like that now, which is a big topic of conversation online, at least. And this is gonna sound, it's crazy. This is gonna sound like radical in 2024, but you only need to find one person. You don't need to date the entire world. So for all the men who are like, all the women suck, like it's impossible to find a good woman, like the general quality, you don't need to date hundreds of millions of women, and they wouldn't let you anyway. And if you're a woman, you don't need to date 100 million guys. Like it could totally be the case that like 80, 90% of 95% of guys you find totally cool. That still means that there's like millions who are dateable, and you only need to find like one who you really like and who really likes you and who you're aligned with to, cool, like you've solved that piece. Right? Like I know you've been married for over 2 decades, right?
Yeah.
So good for you, by the way, man. I have massive respect for that. And so cool, like all right, cool. Sorted. Like that whole thing, you don't need to worry about like what those other hundreds of millions or billions of people out there are doing, because it's like, well, cool, like I'm good. So and I'd say as well, on that front, become someone who is worth, a lot of people complain about like the whole dating culture and relationships and this and that, but like become a great version of yourself.
Yes.
If you're a guy, if you're a young man, become the type of man who you would, I don't know, if you've got a sister, become the type of man you'd want your sister to date. Right? Become the type of man that women like actually want to be with, and they're, oh, actually, like, man, like that guy he's attractive and he's cool and he's got certain capabilities and he's competence on. Women, same thing, right? Don't just be just I am who I am, and so every man should just bow down to me and love me. It's like, no, that's delusional, right? Like physically, mentally, spiritually, like build, get yourself up to a point where you are an attractive proposition. I mean, women, it's even easier, right? Like become an attractive proposition, and then you can literally like pick you'll have suitors, again, to use an old school term, and you can be like, okay, cool. Like this is the guy that I like and who I'm aligned with, and cool. Again, you've now solved that piece. And I think people get locked in this thing of, you need to go on like hundreds of thousands of dates and be with all these different people and this and that. And people are just going out there just very recklessly in many cases. And then they're getting jaded throughout the process, and no one is really happy with it. It's funny, Tom. Like the older I get, the better I understand why certain traditions and ways of doing things exist. Right? Like the better I understand that all our ancestors from like thousands of years ago, the reason they had certain social codes and norms and ways of doing things and traditions. It wasn't just like, hey, we just want to be mean and oppress people and limit all your freedoms. It was just like, hey, okay, we've been around for a few thousands of years. We've tried things a lot of different ways. And this is what we have found works for the vast majority of people and is generally good for our society and nation as a whole. And so that's why we've kind of settled on ways of doing things and why we've given certain instructions through various means. And so I think there's this, to use a C.S. Lewis term, chronological snobbery that's kind of happening in our era, where we assume that we're so much smarter than all the people who came before us, and that we can just throw all that stuff away and just completely reinvent the wheel and just, you know what, let's just try all of this stuff and just everyone just do whatever you want to do. As long as it's legal, just do anything. That's not great advice. And I don't think it's quote unquote judgmental to say that there are ways of doing things and ways of operating that are better than others. And even the people who choose to really learn it the hard way, they still tend to learn it eventually. And I think I would like to encourage young people in particular to avoid some of those mistakes if you can. Like, here's a great thing to do if you're like, I don't know, 20 or 30 or 20, 25, 30, however old you are, is to look at people a few decades older than you and look at the different paths they've taken and decide, okay, where do you want to be? You're 20 years old right now. Look at the people who are 40 or 50 and look at their path and the decisions they made along that time, and find the people who you aspire towards, and also find the opposite. Find the people you're like, oh my gosh, I don't want my life to look anything like that, and proceed accordingly.
Let me ask you, who's living your ideal life?
My parents. They are now my dad's in his late 70s. My mom's in her late 60s. They have 5 awesome kids, if I can say so myself. They have, all my siblings are married. I'm the only one who's not married yet. They've all got kids. I have 5 nieces and 5 nephews. My parents have 10 grandkids, with, Lord willing, more to come. And they're happy. They're healthy. They live with meaning and purpose. They've been married for almost 50 years, still totally in love with each other. They're close to God. They're close to their community. They do a lot of good things, both in the UK and back home in Nigeria. They're just wonderful people. And that is what I aspire towards. I've achieved success in various areas so far and done, taken some unorthodox paths, and will continue to. But when I look at, okay, when I'm my dad's age, when I'm like approaching 80, and I'm looking at my life, what would I like it to look like? And yeah, I see that he's a guy I know. He could, I don't even want to think about my dad dying, but like he could die tomorrow and he'd be like fully content, right? He'd be like, cool, I did my job, God, I'm good. Like I did it. And so, yeah, I find that very aspirational. And my dad's he's a medical doctor, and he's achieved a lot of success. He's been a doctor for over 50 years, still practicing. So he's helped thousands of people. He's so educated. He's done so much. Such a smart guy. But I know with him for sure, like his relationship with God and his family and that legacy would be like the ultimate thing, that he's just like, yeah, I mean, that's why I even did all this. That's why I even worked so hard. He's made so many sacrifices, moving to different countries and countless sacrifices. And yeah, that's my answer.
You once said that the conservative value system has advantages for people. I want to know, what are those advantages?
It works, and it's rooted in reality. And I'd say by definition, something being culturally or socially conservative means that it is maintaining some type of status quo that has typically existed for centuries and sometimes millennia. And in most cases, not in all cases, if something has survived that long and persisted that long and helped human beings for that long, then there is a reason for it. And I think that one mistake we're making, particularly in the modern West, is being very quick to throw away old ideas, sometimes just because they're old, and embrace new ideas just because they're new, which is not very intelligent. I'm very open to new ideas and innovation and the world moving forward in good directions that help humanity. But I think sometimes we're moving forwards in very reckless ways, which are causing a lot of damage. And people want change just for the sake of change. And at the same time, people are sometimes quick to throw away and jettison things that are considered traditional or old or quote unquote conservative and so on, just because they're not new. And I think that's incredibly foolish.
So talk to me about the idea of it being rooted in reality. What do you mean by that?
What I mean is that it's funny because I think we live in a time where this is truer than ever, where in the past decade, 10 to 15 years in particular, if we look at our countries, if you look at the UK, if you look at the USA, if you look at Canada, you look at Australia, certain parts of Western Europe. I mean, Tom, we're having a debate, quote unquote, for the past 10 years about, how many genders there are. Can a man be a woman? What is a woman? What is a man? Can a man get pregnant? Things that we'd worked out many thousands of years ago across all species before people even knew what science was. And then suddenly in 2012, 2014, all of a sudden this becomes controversial for me to say that men don't get pregnant. I mean, you could talk to the most liberal person in the year 2008 and you would get zero pushback for that statement, right? There was nothing confusing about that. You ask them, do you think men should be able to compete in women's sports? They're like, no, of course not. That's a crazy idea. Men are different from women. And now fast forward 10, 15 years, and these conversations are not just happening at the sort of ground level, but at the political level, at the policy level, at the legal level, all of these things. You think that we've solved all the actual issues if we're going to navel gaze and start discussing all of these things. And that's what I mean. That's just not rooted in reality. And it shouldn't even be a political statement. So things have become politicized and have been split into left-right issues or liberal conservative issues when they're not. And then on top of it, there's just a fear around it all. There's a fear of people saying, hey, I agree with everything you just said, but I wouldn't be able to publicly say that, or I might get fired from my job if I say that, or so on. And that's just crazy. That's just insane. And then when people are pushing policies and advocating for ideas which just are not tenable, okay? So open borders, defund the police. All right, let's just scrap the police and abolish the whole prison system. Just like that. I mean, that is not an idea that's rooted in reality. I don't know how you can have any understanding of human nature and just the realities of the world and the harshness and the evil that exists in the world and think it's a good and sound idea to just scrap all law enforcement and just allow people to do whatever they want and hope that everyone's just going to be kumbaya and all nice to each other. I would love to live in that world, but we never have. I mean, I live in the closest to it. I live in Dubai. It's probably as close as you're going to get to that. But even there, part of the reason that is maintained is because of strict rule of law and application of it.
Okay, so before we get to Dubai, do you believe in the idea of a useful fiction?
I think so.
Okay, so
Tell me exactly what you mean by that.
Yeah, so money to me is a useful fiction. Mm-hmm. We'll almost certainly later talk about how the fiction side of it can derange money and become problematic, but the fact that neither gold nor seashells nor the paper that we use or Bitcoin, none of those are real unto themselves. We have we have literally granted them magical powers and said this thing represents a store of wealth or the ability to exchange for goods or both. So that's a fiction that we all agree upon. Mm-hmm. I probably, knowing a little bit about your background, I might have a harder time convincing you that religion is a useful fiction. So we'll stick with money for now. Okay. But if we agree that there is a class of thing where we say, okay, this isn't strictly true, mm-hmm. but it has tremendous value, why would it be better? I'm not sure what word will fit you the best there, but why would it be better for us to adopt a value system that is tied to reality when fictions can be useful?
Mm-hmm. I would say because you can choose to ignore reality, but you can't ignore the consequences of that. So I think that there can be useful fictions, but there can also be dangerous and destructive fictions. if you went out and you managed to convince a significant chunk of the population that 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2, but in fact equals 3, then you've now broken mathematics. Downstream from that, you've broken computer science, you have broken technology, you've broken engineering. I don't want to fly in a plane or drive over a bridge that's been created by engineers who don't believe in the basics of mathematics, because now we've got a problem. So the issue is what are the real world impacts of these things? And I think that's now what we are dealing with. I think with a lot of these ideas, even some of these things that I've spoken about 10 years ago when they started to gain popularity, someone might just shrug their shoulders and think, okay, well, whatever, laissez-faire. People can believe what they want, can do what they want, and so on and so forth. Doesn't affect me directly, so why should I care? By the way, I think that attitude is one of the things that's generally causing a lot of the problems in our society. And so I think that the results matter. The tangible results matter. If someone wants to look at data and science, that's one way of doing it. But a lot of the things that people are now needing studies to prove are things which we've intuitively known for thousands of years, because we've had thousands of years of human experimentation. We can look not just at one country, but we can look at 200 plus countries and countries that have even ceased to exist. And we can see what they did right. We can see what they did wrong. We can see what led to the downfall of various empires. We can look to our ancestors. As I said before, we can see that the things that they did right, which we want to take on and maintain. We can look at things that they obviously did wrong and where they erred and where they strayed. And we can say, okay, you know what, guys, let's not repeat that again. And I think that is wise to do both on an individual level and on a collective level.
So I love the idea that Jordan Peterson has popularized. It's certainly not his idea, but the fact that to sin comes from Latin or something like that, to miss the mark, right? So that your aim was poor. So if we talk about good and bad, which is inherent in what you're talking about, that there's one belief system that is checked against reality that yields good outcomes, and then failing to take heed of the consequences of an action that is not tied to reality would be bad. So what is the bullseye that you're aiming at? It's what I call the North Star.
Sure.
What's your North Star?
Do you mean for me personally?
What do you believe people, like I steer towards human flourishing, which of course we could do a whole podcast on how the hell you define that. But at least I have a thing that I run in my own head of, does this lead closer to human flourishing or farther away? Which is why I'm just completely against anything that feels like it's on the slippery slope to tyranny. That comes from my belief that tyranny is arguably the single thing that moves us most rapidly away from human flourishing.
Yes.
Again, to be debated, but at least I have internal consistency in my mind. So that's my North Star. What North Star do you check good and bad against?
For me personally, I would have to say godly righteousness.
Can you define that? Because I don't know what you mean by that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm a Christian, so my worldview is based on that before anything political or culture war-y or whatever. That's my fundamental, that's where my core values are aligned.
To be aligned with God.
The 10 Commandments and the general teachings of Jesus Christ, and to try to live my life according to that righteously. In terms of things that are, to expand that out a little bit, if I were to give you a couple of North Stars, which might be perhaps clearer to understand for people who may not necessarily be religious, I would say righteousness still. And with that, I would say truth and liberty. And I think that I'd say them all together because I think just striving purely for liberty, for example, liberty in the absence of righteousness, or in the absence of some type of moral and ethical framework, it's not inherently good. I believe that as human beings are made in the image of God, and we are made free. We are born free and with liberty. That's not something that is granted to us from anything but our Creator. I just think by existing, you are essentially supposed to be free. interestingly, I think even from a religious perspective, God's not saying, hey, I'm going to force you and mandate that, I'm not even going to force you to worship me, right? People have been rejecting God since the Old Testament. Go and read it. It's just a cycle of back and forth of rebellion and adherence and rebellion and adherence. So I think that liberty alone, in the absence of morality and ethics, it's just chaos, right? If it's just, okay, you are free to do whatever you want, and that's that, then I think we can very quickly see how that doesn't lead to a great situation or society. It's just recklessness. Everyone just do whatever you want. If it makes you feel good, just go out there and do it. So regardless of the type of society, people immediately understand, okay, we need certain boundaries. We need laws. We need social codes. We need sets of morals. We need sets of ethics. So I think that's where the righteousness aspect comes in. And then I also think truth, because if you are pursuing truth, by the way, I love this question because I've never even thought about it like this before. I'm just sort of thinking on the fly here. And I think truth as well. I think that truth is an aspect of righteousness. I think that truth is the check against tyranny, because you don't get tyranny when people are free to tell the truth and try to seek and decipher the truth. I know that you have studied a lot of tyranny throughout history, various authoritarian regimes, tyrannical regimes. It doesn't matter if it's a monarchy or if it's fascism or if it's communism, whatever it is. One of the common things is the truth is massively suppressed, and everyone is so afraid to speak the truth and to try to find the truth that everyone just goes along with a lie. And once everyone starts lying and everyone is fearful, and then that's when the system just metastasizes, right? It ossifies, and now you're in a really scary situation, because if you even do say the truth, you're now at the stage where, okay, you might be brutalized, you might be thrown in a gulag, you might be killed and your family killed because you dared to say something that was true. And I think that when people lie constantly, whether by commission or by omission, then that has consequences, of course, for themselves. And that's something you'll feel in your consciousness and your soul. And as we say, it might be hard to look at yourself in the mirror because you're feeling like a coward and you're not doing the right thing. But then on the grander scale, as you expand out to your family, to your community, to your nation, and to the world, that can have very dire and severe consequences. And oftentimes I think people don't see that until it's a bit too late. And then they start wondering, well, how did we get here, right? How have we arrived at this scenario? And it's like, well, nobody told the truth. Everyone was scared. And I think there's a big difference between being truthful and getting it wrong versus lying, right? So I don't run under the assumption that everything I think or believe or I say is right and correct, but I won't say anything that I don't believe to be true. If I know that the truth is here, I'm not going to say something totally different. Every single day I'm learning, I'm talking to other people, iron is sharpening iron, and I'm getting smarter and being able to consider things from different ways. But I think I can genuinely say that it's funny. I was on a podcast last year, and the host said that everybody lies, and I said, I don't lie. He was like, I don't believe. He's like, you don't lie? I was like, no, I genuinely don't think I lie. Like I get things wrong, but I don't knowingly lie. I'm not going to go on a podcast or stand on a stage or go online and say something that I just straight up know. What about, did these jeans make my ass look fat? I will tell the truth. Respect. You don't need I might phrase it in a way that lessens the blow, but yeah, I will tell the truth, and I that's something that's very important to me. And in the past few years, a lot of people have commented on my courage or bravery or whatever it is, and it's just I just try to be truthful. I just try to be honest. I don't try. It's just maybe it's my default pattern. And perhaps also just having an awareness of what can happen when you start compromising on that and you start to wrap yourself in this web of deceit, and you start to just kind of play along with things like obviously not to be true. It doesn't lead to good places. Yeah, and if truth is one of your core tenets, I can certainly see adhering to that.
talking about righteousness, I want to understand that righteousness, I believe, when I look at religion, that they are proxies for how to live the good life. Now, again, when you hit the word good, you know that there is a value system already inherent. Yes. There is a North Star that they're aiming at. I believe that religions, all the ones that I'm aware of, are a book about how to live a life in accordance with that ultimate North Star. You're Christian, yeah?
I'm a Christian, that's right.
Okay, so do you believe that the Christian faith puts righteousness and gives you the 10 Commandments, just as a quick stand-in for the things that it's preaching, as a way to get people to live a quote-unquote good life?
Yes, you could say that.
All right, what is the good life?
I think the good life is, I mean, it's going to sound like almost a repetition. I mean, it's living in accordance with God and God's commandments. And I think that
if you
downstream
had to avoid
from
the
that,
that's what I want to get to.
Yeah, sure. I'm going to say if it's downstream from that, then it leads to what you talk about. It leads to human flourishing. If people actually, regardless of, I mean, I think it would be quite hard to disagree, regardless of someone's position, whether they're totally atheistic or they're agnostic or they're a different religion or they're, wherever they are. I think if we were to follow the commandments and the teachings of Jesus, even like just the basic stuff, love your neighbor as yourself, the world, our societies would look very, very different. And one thing about being even, being a follower of Christ is we recognize that we ourselves are not perfect with this, right? It's all a battle. It's all a struggle. Human beings are essentially, we're sinful. We are sinful creatures. We are naturally rebellious, and we do things that are self-serving, and we get angry, and we can experience jealousy and bitterness and resentment and anger and all types of things on different scales and levels. And that's when things go south. So I think that both on an individual level and on a societal level, it's like, hey, if you follow these guidelines, then that leads to the human flourishing for you as an individual, also for your wife, if you treat your wife as you are commanded to, and wives treat their husbands as they're commanded to, and their children, and children respect their parents and love them in the way that they're supposed to, and we just extend that out to the society, then in theory, cool, yeah, there's no more war. Like, there's no stealing, there's no more, like, these things are very clearly, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not kill, right? Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's stuff, house, wife. And when we err, when we stray from that, or we try to blow it up and, I don't know, recreate it with some other ideology that we over-intellectualize in some cases, then it just doesn't go well. Sometimes for some individual, you might be able to get away with it for a while and take pleasure in the hedonism and the materialism of it. But even the people who take that path, what I find so fascinating is even people who do take that path, those who are self-aware and self-correcting, they tend to come around, right? They tend to, okay, I tried all that and I still felt hollow. I still felt empty. I still felt that thing in me like, what I'm doing isn't really, it's not right. It's not good. It's not righteous. So it's interesting that even when people stray extremely far out of those bounds, that they tend to correct because of reality, right? Because of the results of it, because of the fruit that it bears. And so I just don't think you can get away from those, what I would consider basic and fundamental truths.
I really wish more people were self-correcting. I wish more people were willing to admit that they were wrong. But while I share a deep fundamental optimism for humans, I am tempered by the real world that has taught me over and over that it takes a tremendous amount of self-awareness and intellect.
Humility.
Yes.
Humility is a huge one.
Also, to really complicate things, humility But also, I think that the idea of the Luciferian intellect is also correct. And so even if you have all the things that would allow you to be self-correcting, you can still spill over in the opposite direction.
Yeah.
Humans are extraordinarily complicated. So I unfortunately think the Buddhists are probably closest to right in that all of life is suffering and that humans have a very hard time escaping that in any meaningful way.
Mm-hmm.
But before I derail us entirely on that.
Oh, no, that's fine. I was going to say, I think Christians believe the same thing.
Hmm.
I mean, that is the story of Jesus. I mean, a story of suffering. That is, I don't know if you can really top that one. As Jordan Peterson always says, bear your cross and carry it, carry a load and make a sacrifice, make sacrifices. And those sacrifices are ultimately worthwhile when you do them in accordance with a higher good.
Making meaning out of your burden.
Yeah, making meaning out of the suffering. You're absolutely right that we cannot escape suffering. I mean, at a minimum, we are all going to, at a bare minimum, we're all going to die. That's a start.
Not a great start, Zuby. Sounds like an end to me.
We're all going to die, right? Everyone we know,
except Brian Johnson. Brian, please don't be offended.
Everyone we know and love, we're going to die. We're all going to experience illness and sickness, probably various forms of injury, particularly as we get older. As amazing as someone's life may be and free of suffering and fun as it is now, long term, that's what it all trends towards. So, the question that people always ask, what's the meaning of life? What's the purpose? And so on. It's like, well, in that meantime, while we are here on this earthly realm, what do you do with that? How do you spend your time? How do you spend your resources, your energy, your time? What do you prioritize? What do you do? What do you avoid doing? When you do things that are wrong, how do you account for that? How do you respond to it? And the people have been asking these questions for millennia through philosophy, religion, various ideologies and belief systems, and everyone's got one. People like to pretend they don't. Everyone operates under some amalgamation of, I don't want to say an ideology because I think that's a little bit too strong, but there was a term you used earlier.
Don't know.
Was it value system?
Frame of reference.
Frame of reference, yeah.
Everyone has a frame of reference, but I think what you're touching on is more important, which the words I use for what I think you're trying to articulate right now is that everybody has a God-shaped hole inside of them, and they will fill it with something.
Yes.
And that something may be drugs, maybe sex, maybe food, maybe religion.
Yes.
But it's going to get filled.
Yeah, I agree with that. I would say that regardless of someone's ideas and beliefs about how we got here and how we came to be, it seems self-evident that human beings are a religious species. Sometimes people get sort of triggered or upset when I say that because they think I'm saying that.
What do you mean by that then?
Well, it's clear. I mean, I believe something like 90% of the world's population believes in God.
A God, right?
Yes, in some
Not the same
form.
God.
Yes, in some form believes in a God or a supernatural higher power.
Yep.
And as far as I know, that has always been the case. Religion is not new. Religious belief, worshiping gods, deities, even worshiping nature in some form, worshiping idols, these have always existed. I would even say that now, even in the times we live in now, a lot of people have replaced what we'd call traditional religion with other types of belief systems and ideologies and other isms and schisms. So it's very clear to me that human beings have a proclivity, and there's something in us that makes us, we certainly have something in us that makes us worship. I mean, go to a music concert, go to a festival, go to obviously you can go to a church or a synagogue or a mosque, but human beings worship. We worship things, and fundamentally we're social creatures. So we all want a sense of community. We all, of course, want some sense of meaning, direction, purpose, morality. Hey, I'm on this big spinning rock. Like, what is right and wrong? What is good and bad? How do I live my life? How do I interact with and treat other people? What should I pursue? So these are all questions that we just naturally, I think, ask ourselves as intelligent animals. I don't think that, ducks and cockroaches are having these conversations, but human beings, we certainly are, and we're trying to work it out. And so when I say that human beings are fundamentally religious, I just mean that it's wired in us in some way, whether someone just thinks that's purely evolution or someone thinks, hey, that is how we are created. And obviously we have this instinct because God put that instinct in us, regardless of what somebody believes. I'm just saying that it is there. It is there. You could take someone who is like, there are people who are fanatically evangelical about their atheism, which I personally find hilarious. Like, I find that kind of funny when someone is so atheistic that it becomes their religion. Like, that is their entity. It's in their bio on Twitter and on Instagram that they are an atheist. Like, I don't even have Christian in my bio. And I'm like, so you're very expressly putting forward the thing that you're saying you don't even believe in. And that's how you're explicitly defining yourself, and you're dedicating sometimes hours, sometimes dozens of hours dozens of hours a week to the pursuit of this, trying to proselytize and push other people. Like, I'm not an atheist, but I always like to imagine that if I were, I'd be like a meh atheist, right? I wouldn't be like an anti-theistic, like I need to go out there and convert other people, get that percentage of the atheist population up, right? It doesn't.
The Richard Dawkins.
Yeah, I find that kind of odd. Even him, it's interesting because I think even he is sort of changing his stance on this a little bit. He's not as militant as he used to be.
I'd have to look
in
closer,
this regard.
But the clips that I've seen,
just going on recent interviews I've seen anyway.
Yeah, the clips that I've seen, he does not seem comfortable when people say what you're saying now. So even if his stance is softening, I don't know that he views it as his stance.
And he calls himself a cultural Christian.
Yes.
And he talks about how much he likes many Christian teachings and he loves churches, and he thinks that it's terrible that churches in the UK are being replaced by mosques and so on and so forth.
He said not too long ago, I mean, this has got to be last 6 months, so-and-so calls himself a cultural Christian, but unlike me, he means it. And so I was like, yeah, this feels like the Dawkins that I know.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I mean, I haven't spoken to him, so I don't want to assume
in
too
fairness,
much.
I haven't spoken to him in a long time either, but I have a feeling that he may not, I do not speak for Richard Dawkins, let me be very clear, but he may not be the poster child that people want him to be.
Sure.
Now, one thing so I totally agree with you that we are a religious species. I like your definition that there is going to be a thing that is so all-consuming of your identity because it gives you a value system that you can just wholesale say, because I am this thing,
yes, I
have a value system and I will live according to that. What I want to understand, when a person looks at religion as a useful fiction, then the religious collision that we're about to live through, I don't think is a big deal. But when you really believe it is the true word of God and it is to be defended with your life, now you get something that historically has had an extremely high cost in human life. And I believe that we are rushing towards a Western collision between Christianity and Islam.
Interesting.
And I'm very curious, especially as somebody who grew up in Saudi Arabia and the UK, how you think that will play out. Will people find, hey, we are, it's all the book of Abraham. And so we have a unity and they'll find that unity? Or like we have seen many times throughout history where these two religions collide, that it is a game of conquest and taking over and winning and losing?
Man, that's a huge and heavy question. And I expect some people to disagree with everything I say. My perspective on this is, personally, as someone who lived in Saudi Arabia for 20 years and who now lives in the United Arab Emirates, I have never seen that a gigantic clash and conflict between these worldviews and belief systems is necessary and inevitable at all, in fact. I think that what would cause that to happen is the human sin itself. And people violate, look, what is, thou shalt not kill. In Christianity, you are not supposed to, if you're a Christian, you're not meant to kill people. If you're a Muslim, you're not meant to kill people. If you are Jewish, you are not meant to kill people, right? So if you are getting to the stage of fanaticism and extremism, where you think that you are right and justified in slaughtering innocent people in the name of your religion, then, I mean, at its core, you've violated it in the most massive way possible. We're going to have disagreements. I mean, the most obvious disagreement between the three Abrahamic religions, the three main ones, is who exactly is Jesus Christ, right? That's the most obvious differentiation between them. In Islam, he is a prophet and he's the Messiah, but they don't believe he's the Son of God because they don't believe that God has or can have a son. Christianity, you obviously believe he is the Son of God. You believe Father, Son, Holy Spirit, the Trinity. Judaism does not revere Jesus Christ in the same way that Islam does, let alone Christianity does. You know, they, depending on the Jewish person, they might just believe he was a person who was a heretic who was, you know, executed for his sins, or he was a false teacher or something like that. And the theological differences matter. If you're having a, you know, deep religious conversation or discussion or debate, then that obviously matters. But in terms of how we conduct ourselves here on this earth and how we interact with other people, then yeah, look, we're not meant to hurt, kill, steal from each other or anyone. And as soon as someone, regardless of their viewpoint, is trying to justify that, then I would say they are absolutely in the wrong. And people, religious and irreligious alike, gosh, if there's one thing we should all be able to agree on, like, hey, let's not murder each other, right?
I wish.
Yeah.
I wish.
And the thing is as well with this, Tom, is the truth is 99% of people agree with this, regardless of their claimed or actual belief systems. It's a very, very tiny percentage of humanity that chooses to do the worst stuff possible. And sadly, that has a very outsized impact and it taints our entire species. But I think the thing is as well is people can murder or kill or steal under any or no ideology. So you can have someone who goes and kills because, I don't know, you know, they don't have any strong belief system. They just were angry, or someone had something that they wanted and they decided to go and kill, or they were part of a gang which had some, you know, it was an initiation, or they were running on, there are eco-terrorists. There are people who think you should kill because of, you know, save the planet. So terminate the humans, or like there's all sorts of weird fringe beliefs. There's people who kill over politics. There are left-wing extremists who kill. There are right-wing extremists who kill. There are atheists who kill. There are Christians. There are Muslims. There are so on and so forth. And that's down to the individual. You know, that's the individual. Just on this note, it's fascinating because, I mean, thinking of numbers, I just, a couple of weeks ago, I was in El Salvador. I was invited to Nayib Bukele's inauguration, which was cool because he's one of the only world leaders that I actually massively respect. So El Salvador used to be the most dangerous country in the world.
It's crazy.
At its worst, it had triple the homicide rate of Haiti.
Whoa. All right.
Okay.
Hey, set goals, man.
Right? Like Haiti
Lord.
is not known to be, you know, some lovely utopia. So it's now the safest country by homicide rate in the entire Western Hemisphere.
Wow.
It's got a third of the murder rate of the USA. It's safer than Canada statistically. Wow. This all changed in under a decade. So it's a population of, I think, about 6.3 million people. The President Bukele, he put between 60 and 70,000 people in prison, and that dropped the homicide rate by 97%. Man. 1% of the population in prison drops the murder rate 97%. So just that simple math says a lot to me in terms of how big a chunk of the human beings it is in any given society or culture that predates on everybody else. And I think you'll find that in virtually, you know, the numbers are going to vary slightly from country to country and city to city, but that's really the situation. So I think oftentimes, sadly, people sometimes blame things on I think it's trendy to blame religion on certain things or blame certain ideologies and belief systems on things when it's not really that. It's just the human sin. Now, I agree that there can be an ideology that's so extreme that where, homicidal or genocidal intention is coded within it, right? Where that is part of the ideology. And if someone starts following that and really believing it, obviously we have a problem, right? But I've never come across someone who's like, all right, my goal is to follow Jesus and to live as closely as I can according to his teachings. Like, if that is your goal, like, you're not going to end up, maybe you'll be a little too nice, right? a little too kind. People might try to take advantage of you in some ways. But yeah, you're not going to go out there and be harming people or taking their stuff, let alone killing them. Like, that would be completely counter to all of those teachings, and that would make someone, not just a criminal, but a gigantic hypocrite.
So while I acquiesce to the extremely fascinating data point around El Salvador, and obviously agree that in a civilized nation, it's going to be a small percentage of the people that are doing the vast majority of the crime. I mean, even just power law dynamics. But if I isolate this back to religion, and before you and I were on camera, we happened to talk about something similar. And we were talking about history. And my whole thesis is, if you want to understand the future, you need to only look to the past, because the past is just an explanation of what humans are like. And so if we look in the past at what humans are like, you find that wars really get fought for one of three reasons. Reason number one is a clash of religions. So my God says you're bad, and therefore clash. Economics. So I want your shit and I'm going to come take it. And then reason number three, which is maybe the most terrifying, which is God said I should come take your shit. And so normally...
What's the difference between 1 and 3 there?
So the last one is, I'm going to leverage the fact that you are a religious species, and I'm going to get you all to mobilize, not because it's in your best interest. I'm the king. I'm literally channeling the Crusades here. Okay. So the Crusades started out as, no, for real, God really wants us to go rescue Jerusalem. And then it very quickly became, I as a lord would go whip up people saying, hey, we're going to go rescue Jerusalem. And then they would never even go to Jerusalem, because this was really about just getting an army together and going and doing something else. And you say that it's in the name of God, and then people go with it.
I think that almost all wars are actually number 2. I think sometimes they use number 1 and number 3 as justification and to rally and gain support from the population. But virtually every war is about resources and influence and power.
Okay, so give me a lens on Israel-Palestine. I don't need your take, because I know it's uber complicated, but just because what I'm really trying to tease out is your belief system around religion, how that informs this human flourishing. It gives us a way to live. But as somebody on the outside who doesn't believe, I'm like, hey, these are useful fictions, but I know where these things collide. And so Israel-Palestine is an easy thing to point at, where I'd love your take on, is religion playing any role in this, or is this purely economic?
I think it plays some role. It would be dishonest for me to say it plays no role. Of course it plays some role. Because
religion.
It does, yes. Because there are, and like I'm not an expert at Christianity, let alone Islam or Judaism. I know from certain Muslims I've spoken to. In fact, there's a guy named Luai Al-Sharif, who's based in, he's Saudi, but he lives in the UAE. But he was telling me that when he was a kid growing up in Saudi Arabia, he was like, I hated Jews, right? He had been taught and kind of learned that he is supposed to. And there are certainly Muslims. I'm aware there are even also Christians, which is weird to me given Jesus, but there are people out there who they have been taught, they've been raised to hate. Just like if you were to go not so far back in history, there were white people who were raised and taught to be racist. They were taught to hate, to fear black people, to look down on them, whatever it might be. There were black people who were raised to, hey, the white man is the devil, those blue-eyed devils, whatever it is. There's people to this day that believe that, right? They hold on to that you could call it religion, some you could call it ideology. It could just be, some would call it brain. I don't know. I don't really know what you call it. So you can certainly teach and learn hatred. And so there is no question. I'm far from any expert in the Israel-Palestine situation, but I know for a fact that there is some percentage of those populations where there is a genuine hatred. There is a genuine hatred for the other tribe. And on both sides, there are individuals who have genocidal beliefs and rhetoric around that, right? There are people who just think Israel should be wiped off of the map with everything that entails. And there are Israelis, I have no idea what the percentage is. I'd imagine it's a very small amount, who also feel the same way, vice versa. With that said, it's also a massive land dispute, right? The questions are about the legitimacy of this nation, and everyone, depending on what side people are on, from what I've gathered, this is crazy. By the way, this is the first time I've ever even touched on this issue in a podcast, because I just avoid it. There's an issue around the land and who owns it, who has a right to it. Some people want to start the story, in the 1940s. You can go back many thousands of years. I mean, if you're reading the Old Testament of the Bible, you're going back thousands of years, and they're talking about Israelites in Israel, right? So it doesn't strike me that this just, popped up in the 1940s or something like that. So I don't know, man. These things are complicated. I think when you're just widening the conversation a little bit, even when you're talking about land disputes, I mean, human beings have been conquering land for however long. I mean, who has the right to the USA? All right, there will be people who would say that the USA is occupied right now, right? The Native Americans or even an individual tribe has rights to this specific land, and no matter how much time passes, hey, they were there before, and they should maintain that rights. Other people would say, have a more of a might is right kind of argument, and say, well, it was conquered. A lot of people factor time into this, right? Time sort of matters, where if the longer you've held the land, the more your right to it kind of grows. I don't know if that is correct, but I just think that's how we tend to process it. But you can look at a lot of land all around the world. I mean, borders have been drawn and redrawn many, many times. And I think this is also, I think in our lifetime, Tom, I think we thought that we were just like past this all. I think this is why their reaction to Russia invading Ukraine was kind of how it was, and the response to the Israel-Palestine conflict, because there have been lots of conflict, throughout our relatively short lives. But I think these are just reminders of this tribal warfare and of the fact that war is a possibility. I mean, if you just go back, the 1900s, World War I, World War II, in Europe itself. Now when people think of Europe, they think of like a wonderful travel destination and tourism, right? Like that's what people think now when they think of Europe. But if you just go back under 100 years ago, it was like people just invading each other's lands. Cool. We're going to roll in there with the tanks. We're going to go in there. Like we're going to expand this border. Like Germany is growing, and we're pushing back here. And, it was just, the borders weren't really respected. And so I think we all thought that maybe there was some type of complacency where everyone just thought, okay, like that's history. We're past that. These are the lines on the map. Everyone respect those lines. And so when someone is like, nah, we want a little bit more. And it's just like, what? You can't do that. And I thought that we'd stopped doing that. And then people have that realization of, oh, okay, it's not static and stable and all peaceful, and we might like it to be, but there are still going to be these incursions. And I would like to think and hope that this century, God, I pray that this century is not like the previous one, because the 20th century was gnarly, man. Like it was horrible. I think people forget how recent it is.
Yes.
I think people forget just how recent it is. Like
when you look at Mao's timeline,
yeah,
it gets real sweaty, real fast. I don't think he died until the 70s.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think I was alive, but whoa, was it close.
Yeah, dude, I'll tell you what I've been, I'm reading a book right now. on something horrible that happened, you know, in our lifetime, but which I'm reading a book on the Rwandan genocide right now.
Oof.
1994. 3 months, about 800,000 people killed by their own neighbors
with
machetes. Right.
That's the part that just
okay.
God.
So we all go, we study Nazism. If you're most people study that in school. If you're a bit more intellectually motivated, you'll study communism. But I was just like, okay, 1994. This is when I was 8 years old. And by the way, I remember on the TV, like hearing about stuff like Hutus and Tutsis and Rwanda and genocide. I didn't really know what these words meant, right? But I remember just like, I have a recollection of in the TV in the background and them talking about something called a genocide, right? And just reading this book, it's so sobering and frightening because it didn't even, like, it really didn't make sense. It was just pure hatred and groupthink because people were killing their own neighbors. This wasn't like, okay, the government is rolling in and persecuting people. This is two ethnic groups, which, by the way, are not even ethnic groups in the hard way that we typically understand it. It was more of a class distinction, right? They speak the same language. Most of them are supposed to be Christians, right? These are people who went to church together, went to the same schools, played on the same football teams, farmed in the same places, everything. Lots of them even intermarried. And then literally an event happens and within 24 hours, people are out there hacking their neighbors and friends to death. Some of them killing their own spouses and their own children because they're of a different ethnicity. And this went on for 3 months. It was like 100 days, right? Just this brutality for 100 days. Like 800,000 people slaughtered in 100 days. Obviously, internationally, nobody stepped in to stop this. And it was just, stuff like that freaks me out. But I think it's very important to read. I think it's important to read and understand because it shows you, I think it's important not to be like black-pilled on humanity and to think that we're just see the evil and the devilish intent and the homicide and genocide and stealing and like all of that stuff. Like, but it's important to recognize that we are capable of that. And I think that we tend to not really study that stuff in depth because we don't want to, right? It's not really fun studying the Third Reich or studying Mao's China or studying, reading the Gulag Archipelago, reading Ordinary Men, these types of books. Like, it's brutal, but it's not fiction. And that's why it's so important to read it, because then I think that's how you check yourself. I think to be a good person in the way that I would describe it, I think you have to be very aware of your capacity for evil. I think that just believing, hey, I'm just a good person and I'm just inherently good and I don't do bad. I think it's a bit of a dangerous position because then when stuff goes sideways, when stuff hits the fan, you don't really have those boundaries. It's just like, the scary part of all these situations is like, obviously people thought somehow, some way, generally thought they were doing the right thing in all these situations. And it's weird to look back with an objective lens and be like, how can you think that doing what is the most heinous and disgusting and wrong thing obviously is the right thing? And then it's like, what was the build up to this? What led to it? Why wasn't it stopped? You have bystander effect on a gigantic scale going on here. So I think when you just see that, if and when you ever encounter that type of situation or things are even tilting in that way, you talk a lot about the sort of creeping tyranny. And I think one of the reasons you're so sensitive to it is because you've studied it, right? So you can see the echoes, you can see the parallels and be like, wait, this thing is reminding me of that thing. And we're not there yet, but if you keep allowing this to escalate, we could, before we know it, we could get to a situation where, like, I would imagine that if you were in, I don't know, if you were just a person in 1910, living in England, living in Germany, living in France, and someone were to tell you what was going to take place over the next 40 years, I think you would have been like, come on, man. Like, we've evolved past that, right? Like, right? Mm-hmm. We're modern people, right? What do you mean? It's 1910. It's not 1500, right? Mm-hmm. We're past all that. Like, that can't happen. What do you mean? Come on. We're not going to have these dictators and multiple genocides and 100 million plus deaths. Like, that doesn't even, it doesn't even make sense. And it's like, okay, here we are now, 100-ish years later. And I would also like to think and believe that. But it's just like, hey, we're in the first quarter of a new century. I don't know what happens in the 2030s, the 2040s, 2050s, and so on. Like, we can't predict it. I hope and I pray that it's going to be far less bloody and brutal and nasty than the previous century. But I think the way we prevent that is by being aware of its possibility. I think if we completely deny our capacity for evil, and we deny that any of us could potentially be on the wrong side of those things, be on the wrong side of history, then that makes it more inevitable. If people don't even recognize that that there's that potential. And so I think there's a danger of focusing too much on the darkness, and there's also a massive danger in just ignoring it and pretending that, nah, we're past that, that's history, we're all good now. Because it could just take some type of scarcity of resources or a certain flashpoint event or something like that, which, not to compare them directly, but look at the whole COVID situation, right? In 2019, if in summer 2019, someone told you what was going to take place from 2020 up until 2022 with like all you would have been like, what? That doesn't make sense. Come on, people aren't going to do that. People aren't going to behave that way. Like it doesn't add up, but yet it took place. And I think if people had more historical awareness and were more sensitive to the tyranny and the way that they themselves could potentially participate in it, then I don't think it would have gone anywhere near as far as it did.
Yeah, agreed. I don't have a lot of optimism that we'll be able to convince people, the majority of people, to look at themselves and say, I have a potential for evil. But I think that it is, because we have so much historical data, I think it is knowable to know what happens when these things collide. That then will hopefully tell us why these things happen. My gut instinct, looking at historical context, is what ends up happening is religions get deformed in people's minds because there's a proxy for the life that you're trying to get people to live. And so they give you the religious framing. This is God. God is telling you to do these things, which I think is very helpful when you want compliance. Why should I do this? Because God told you to. I just saw, he had to be a preacher. He talked like a preacher. And it was he gave this really powerful sermon about why people should be acting a certain way. And he's building to this punchline. You can feel it about why people should do it. For me, the punchline would have to be because it leads to human flourishing, and this is obvious, and look at the data. But he goes, because God said to do it. And I was like, oh, wow. Like, that really is the best capstone. If people believe it, that's the best capstone. There's nobody else. There's no, like, you've appealed to the highest authority. And so the problem becomes when you either misinterpret what God said or you fail to understand, okay, language is tricky, so I might be misinterpreting this. What are we really trying to get to? Because all these words are a proxy to lead me somewhere. And if they're not leading me there, now we have a problem.
It's interesting because the thing that came into my brain is, to me, those punchlines are the same. As long as religion or human beings' interpretation of it has not been massively corrupted, then it's not just, God says so because he is a tyrant or a bully or something like that. If you believe that God's commandments are based on what leads to the maximal human flourishing, then it's ultimately the same. It's the same statement phrased in a different way. One is religious language. One is more secular language.
Sure. That makes sense? What I'm saying is you need to look at the data.
Yes.
And so if you're using a proxy, God told me, and you're saying, okay, we just killed 800,000 people, but God, this is all following God's lines. Like, I'm just doing what I was told.
So all those people, they all stopped. They even, I'm reading a book called Machete Season
These are
and
horrifying titles.
It's a horrifying title. So it's the guy who wrote it. He interviewed the killers. He interviewed about 12 people who participated in the massacre and interviews them. And it's interesting because there's a part I just read yesterday where they're talking about how they stopped. They like everything church and religious related. They stopped, right? They totally stopped it because they were like, they themselves had the conviction of like, wait, this is a hypocrisy. How can I be here?
So religion would have been a constraining force, and
yes,
they had to
exactly right.
Shut that off.
Yeah, the Rwandan genocide was not religious. It wasn't a religious. It wasn't a religious thing.
Well, then
just
let's
like
go
the massacres of the Nazis and the massacres of Mao and the massacres of Stalin were not religious based.
Those are fascinating because that's when you strip religion and what you get people to do.
Strip it away and strip away the value of the human life.
Yes, but crusades were very much a religious thing. And if you listen to Yuval Noah Harari talk about the Israel-Palestine conflict, he's like, we are literally killing each other over a rock. And hearing him talk about it, especially because he's Israeli, so you'd expect him to be sort of culturally, religiously Jewish. He does not strike me as that.
He's very secular.
He's secular.
He's extremely secular.
And so he's able to look at that and go, this doesn't make any sense. We're just fighting over a rock. But when you're fighting over a rock that God told you to fight over, now all of a sudden it's like you see how this stuff
But did
escalates.
God tell you to fight over it?
Well, so what I'm trying to get at is that people can arbitrate that however they want. What I'm saying is, once you realize the Bible, the Torah, the whatever, that is a proxy for the good life. And if you're looking around you and you see, we're not achieving the good life, now it's pump the brakes. Now it's either, and I know how people will interpret this, but it's either God wrote the wrong words, or I am not understanding the words as written. Because if this book, adherence to this book is meant to lead me to the good life, and people are just dying left, right, and center, we have a problem somewhere. And what I'm saying is that's where you want, going back to your original statement, that you have to check it against reality. And so what I'm trying to map in your thinking is you're very careful to say whatever you believe has to be checked against reality. I've heard you say other places, you didn't say it today, but I've heard you say it other places. Reality is gonna slap you in the face. Like you are going to encounter that this thing doesn't work. I'm interpreting doesn't work, meaning it doesn't lead to human flourishing. It does not yield the outcomes that everybody would say these are desirable outcomes. However, I'm not saying you, but I'm saying there are times where religion, which works this incredible magic trick of meaning and purpose and getting people to do things that do lead to a good life, will break down because people start getting lost in the proxy of do this, do that, 10 commandments, this, that, and the other, and they forget it's supposed to yield this outcome. And if not yielding this outcome, figure out what you have to do, either refresh in how you're interpreting this, or, I mean, in my case, another option would be to depart the religion. But either way, you're aiming for human flourishing. So what I want to understand is, given that we can point back to history and just show time and time and time again, we're the very fallible humans. I'm perfectly willing to say God's word is perfect, fine. But these very fallible humans, when encountering God's perfect word, still get into just bloodshed, left, right, and center.
Okay, would you agree that the greatest massacres and slaughters of the last century were all under atheistic regimes?
I will say that there is so much bloodshed under atheistic regimes that I certainly don't let them off the hook.
Yeah.
So what I'm trying to map right now is how you think about how do you resolve religious disputes between religions.
Oh, okay. Wow. I mean, gosh, there's multiple answers to this. I mean, this is why it's funny, because it's kind of circular to me, because I would say by adhering to your religion.
So when you look back at history, it's the
most basic commandment. If you're talking 10 commandments, thou shalt not kill.
Okay, let's address that one.
Okay.
At least in the Torah,
Old Testament.
Old Testament.
There's
Thank you.
there's plenty of violence in that.
Well, not only that, but I don't know if it's in the original Hebrew as it has been relayed to me, that there is a very conscious distinction in the word chosen in Hebrew for kill versus murder. And what it says is thou shalt not murder.
Yes.
So now it becomes a question of, well, what's the distinction? So if somebody's breaking into your house and they're trying to kill your wife, if you kill them, is that murder? Or are you doing exactly what God would want you to do in the face of that evil?
No, it's self-defense. And that's also in the Old Testament, that is self-defense.
How do you, Zuby, from a values perspective, think through the collision of religions? And for me, the importance of this question is I see this coming.
All right. So me personally, again, I grew up in Saudi Arabia as a Christian. I was surrounded from very young age, I've been surrounded by everybody, different ethnicities, nationalities, belief systems, and so on. Growing up, I have tons of Muslim friends, tons of Christian friends, tons of Jewish friends, atheistic friends, Hindu friends, so on and so forth. Our love for each other, being one another's friends, neighbors, countrymen, associates, colleagues, whatever it is, that trumps. Well, firstly, there's no, like within my own religion, I can't speak for every religion out there. There is no reason, there's no commandment or word from God or anything saying that I am supposed to hate anyone, let alone because of their religion or their ethnicity, background, anything like that. Quite the very opposite, in fact. Like the Bible is totally opposed to those. The New Testament teachings are opposed to that. The story of the Good Samaritan, the Golden Rule, all of these things this is not, everyone here is from the same region. It talks a lot about, the foreigners and the Jews and the Gentiles and so on and so forth. And the whole parable of the Good Samaritan, and I think sometimes people overlook this because the whole reason it was a Samaritan is because Samaritans at that time were like the opponents, right? But it was the Good Samaritan who actually helped a man who had been, beaten and stripped and robbed and so on. And Jesus asked which of these people was his neighbor, right? The Pharisee passes by, the person who's supposed to be, a priest, a Levite, passes by and does not help this person. And the person who helps him is someone who, on paper, in terms of their tribes and their ethnic conflicts and whatever, is supposed to be an enemy. I think the most radical commandment in Christianity is love your enemy.
Yep.
Because that is not common sense.
But not all the world adheres to Christianity. So my question is about the collision of religions. So what I hear you saying is you're probably thinking of like the more aggressive elements of Islam. That is certainly a potential issue.
Right.
But even if you back out of that and just think from a value system perspective, if somebody's value system says, I must adhere to the word of my holy scripture, that's where already I start getting nervous.
Okay.
Because I go, whoa, if the word of your holy scripture is infallible, then it might say some things that get deeply uncomfortable, right? You can find things in the Bible that will stress you out if you have to adhere to every word of it.
What specifically?
This is where I am not going to be the best, but I will say, obviously, Old Testament, but stoning people to death for homosexuality as one example. Okay. I'm sure there are many more that.
Mosaic law. So some of the Mosaic laws that were prescribed very specifically for the people at that time, thousands of years ago.
I don't know what Mosaic law is, but I'll say sure.
Okay. Well, Mosaic law is the law of like the laws of Moses. So going back to the Old Testament, the Hebrews, Israelites at a very specific time, they had certain laws and customs. This is where don't eat shellfish, don't eat pork, don't wear clothing of, two different fabrics together, don't cut the sides of your beard and so on, right? Like these things that, Christians don't generally adhere to because there's a separation between the old covenant and the new covenant, which is why, you're not having Christian societies where they're out here stoning people or anything like that. So I'm curious as in like within the New Testament, Is there something there that strikes you as, hey, this is something that a person, even if they were to kind of take it out of context somewhat, this is scary. Like this is something that could lead to violence or something like that? Because
what causes me concern is that you don't have to go back farther than Ireland to see you get wars between Protestants and Catholics and people killing each other and bombing because they believe that they understand the true word of God better than the next person. So I'm just
I get you. My point is simply that there is tribalism.
Yep.
Tribalism exists. My point is that tribalism happens with or without religion.
Agreed.
We were just talking about the Rwandan genocide, completely tribal, right? These people are supposed to be of the same faith, they're countrymen, they're obviously the same race and whatever. I'm not an expert on, the troubles of Northern Ireland, between the clashes between the Protestants and the Catholics. But that strikes me as a tribal conflict, right? So they're not there saying, hey, the Bible says that. I mean, the Bible doesn't even talk about Protestants and Catholics, right? You're all meant to be.
No, but they do have interpretations. So they are saying you're interpreting that thing wrong that he said. But I don't want to get lost in this. What I'm trying to get to is that for me, when you have a clash of religions, you need only ask people, what is your North Star?
Yes.
My belief is that either people are going to agree, let's say Catholics and Protestants, they're going to describe the exact same North Star. And then I'm going to say, amazing. Is what you're doing right now achieving that North Star? No, it's not. And they're going to say one of two things. We have to push through this moment of bloodshed to get to the true word of, in this case, Christ, but that's literally irrelevant. Okay, now we know you guys are going to fight bloody to get on the other side and you don't care about that. And so I'm going to go, cool, that violates my value system. I'm saying you have to diffuse this before this gets violent. And so that's my value system. But at least now you're giving me the thing I need to understand to predict your next move, which I'm all about predictive validity. So my predictive engine tells me that there is a coming collision between Christianity and Islam. So I'm just like, okay, word. Same thing, going to be, hey, I need each group to tell me what their North Star is. What are we aiming for? Do we want human flourishing? Whatever. And we will either be like, oh, wow, okay, cool. You guys are both aiming for the same thing. Amazing. We about to live in harmony? Or do we have to push through some moment of bloodshed and only my way is going to win? And if we can all agree, okay, cool, this is North Star that we're aiming for, now we have the barometer by which we can judge our current and future actions. Oh, I need to stop doing this because it's not yielding that. Or, hey, I'm gonna fucking kill everybody I need to kill to get on the other side of this. And then I can be like, holy shit. But I'm trying to get people to articulate out loud, how are you going to handle this moment? I'm not saying either are right or wrong. I just want to know.
Interesting. I think maybe I'm struggling to understand the question because to me, it's like it's very simple. So I'm not trying to dance around any answers. I'm trying to fully.
I'm probably doing a bad job of explaining. So
so I think, look, how about we can agree on no murder, no violence?
If we can agree on that.
Yeah, if we can agree on that. I mean, generally as a society, we agree on this. Like, if we didn't agree on this as a society, our nations would not function at all. In any way. Look at the USA. The USA is, by many measures, the most diverse country in the world. Certainly one of. You've got probably 350 million people scattered across thousands and thousands of miles, different races, nationalities, backgrounds, ethnicities, religious systems, very different political ideologies, very different ways of living. And you have to have certain basic agreements. So there's a massive amount of diversity. And as long as people respect certain basic principles, then it's okay. People can have conversations about, how much diversity do they think good is bad or what immigration policy should be and so on and so forth. But if you can all agree, hey, despite our differences, by the way, I'd say the political differences are far more fiery in this country than the religious ones. Regardless of our political beliefs, our religious beliefs, where we're from, whatever, we need to agree on some real basic principles. And you can get these from the 10 Commandments or elsewhere. We don't steal. We don't kill. We don't rape. We don't assault. You can't hurt other people. You can disagree with someone entirely. You could take the most the strongest evangelical right-wing Christian and the most atheistic left-wing communist person. And as long as they can agree, hey, we can fight with words, we can argue, we can debate, whatever. I'm not going to take your stuff, and I'm not going to physically hurt you. I'm not going to hurt your family. I'm not going to damage your property. I'm not going to. If people can agree on that, we're good. Like I said, there's a tiny, tiny percentage of people who, with or without religion, they have criminal intent, and they don't respect that. They don't respect human life. They don't respect private property. They're willing to take what they want. They're willing to go out there, assault. And that's always existed, sadly. If the state gets involved in that, then that's when I think we're really, really in trouble, which is why we always have to have that check against tyranny. But if it's just individuals, then the question is, okay, how do we deal with those? The question to me is more like, how do we deal with violent individuals? Okay? Because I don't see a future where, the majority of Muslims, the majority of Christians are wanting to have some like war and clash in this modern era. Like I don't see that. I don't think people want that smoke. I don't think that's what's in people's hearts. If you look even at terrorism, the majority of terrorism that happens in the Islamic world is directed at other Muslims. It's not even like it's often tribal. Again, there might be the veneer of it being based on religion. Oftentimes it's just tribal. It's like this group has some historical beef with the other group, and maybe they, use religion as their means to supposedly rationalize it or to rally other people to their cause by claiming that it's some type of religious fight. This is how I see it. Again, I'm not an expert with what happened in Northern Ireland, but that is how I see it. Like, it is insane to me that a group of Catholics and Christians are going to start like bombing each other, They did. But I don't think that I think they would have done it without the religion. Because we've seen, gosh, my point is just like human beings do this, right? Nazi Germany, that was not about religion. Maoist China, that was not about religion. Soviet Russia, it was not about religion. If you can go through all sorts of conflicts in Europe and in Asia and so on, China versus Japan, like none of that was fueled by religion. It's tribal. And religion is one thing that can put someone in a tribe. And you can go quite narrow with that because there's different denominations even within the same religion. But I think that oftentimes other things are conflated with tribalism. I think a lot of what people in the USA, for example, or in the UK call racism is tribalism. And, my family's originally from Nigeria. And something that's interesting, particularly for Western listeners to understand, is that some of the intertribal conflicts that exist within Nigeria and other African countries are far more venomous and serious than any quote unquote racism that exists in the USA or the UK between black people and white people or anything like that, right? So it's the tribalism. It's not, hey, your skin color is one way that can happen. It can happen with nationality. It can be, I'm British, you're French, so we don't like each other. Like if you look at a British person and a French person, like don't look that different, right? Serbs and Croats, right? It can literally be, do Israelis and Palestinians like ethnically, are they like totally different looking? And they're like, it's like, no, you're from the same region. To an outsider, you might just like see a group of Israelis, see a group of Palestinians, and they're like, I can't really tell the difference visually. So I think a lot of stuff is just tribalism. It's that in-group, out-group. And I think when the problem comes when there is a hatred, an animosity, and ultimately a disrespect for human life.
So I agree with you wildly on that tribalism is a huge problem. I just know if I ask you then, okay, what do we do about tribalism? You're going to come back to people need to adhere to Christian values.
No, I wouldn't even come back to that.
So how do we then?
Because if you want to say, if by Christian values you mean respect for the sanctity of life, love your neighbor as yourself, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not kill, then yeah, totally agree. But I'm also aware that you don't need to be a Christian to believe those things. I don't think those specific things are entirely unique to Christian teachings. Most atheists generally would agree on those points, right? People of other faiths would agree on those points. And that's what needs to be respected. Once you cross that line of, okay, I have a feeling or a belief or an opinion that's in my head, and other people have things in their head, which I may agree with, disagree with, like, dislike, or whatever. Once you cross that line of, okay, therefore I am justified in hurting, stealing, killing, assaulting, no matter your ideology, no matter your supposed belief system or lack thereof, however way you're framing it, no. Right? That has to be the line. I would say the exact same thing politically, right? People can have such varying political opinions, left versus right, conservative, liberal, progressive, woke, anti-woke, whatever, and they can, verbally clash. They can have the battle of ideas. They can even yell at each other in certain times. As soon as someone crosses that line, right, and hits someone, shoot someone, attack someone, no, right? And that's where the rule of law is extremely important. There can't be a tolerance of that. There can't be a tolerance of, okay, well, you were justified because he thought the wrong thing, right? Do you remember a few years ago? I say a few years, it's probably about 8 years ago now. Do you remember that whole, that time when there was that whole punch a Nazi thing? Do you remember that? Okay. I don't like Nazis. But I was like, no, actually. If it's just Nazi is, hey, someone saying things you disagree with or you find distasteful and maybe they even upset you or make you angry. If it's like, hey, okay, you've got a green light to physically assault that person, non-violent person, just saying things. I understand that gut reaction, that animalistic tendency, but it's like, no, actually, that's crossing the line, right? So that's crossing the line when you start violently attacking someone because you don't like something that they said or you don't like a belief that is in their brain. So I actually remember that time because I remember even having arguments and debates with people who were saying oh yeah, that's totally fine, that's justified. And I was like, well, slippery slope, right? Let's think about this. And also let's think about how loosely the word Nazi is being deployed, right? They're just starting to kind of throw that out at anyone who's remotely conservative or right wing. Then what do we have? Punch a commie, punch a socialist? Then what? Punch a liberal? Punch a wokey? No, let's not go there. That's why I guess I think that it's quite simple, because I don't think I think it's agnostic to the religion or the political belief or the ideology or the tribe or the race or the ethnicity or the nationality. I just think it's got to be that line of, hey, no violence, right? This religion is growing, that religion is growing. I think by around 2060, I think the global populations of Muslims and Christianities are going to equalize. So at the moment, there's, I think, about 2.5 billion Christians. Islam, I think, is between 1.5, it's about 1.5 billion, and it's the fastest growing. So that's when it's going to meet a point where the numbers are equal. I think at that point also 40% of Christians will be in sub-Saharan Africa. So here's an interesting fact. I don't know if you know this because it doesn't feel it in the West, but the world is actually becoming more religious as a percentage.
All right, people that get value out of the way you think, where should they follow you?
At Zuby Music on all social media. I'm very big on X, at Zuby Music, but I'm also on Instagram. I'm on YouTube. I'm on Facebook, at Zuby Music. And if you go to zubymusic.com, you can find links to everything I do, my music, my podcast, my books, everything, zubymusic.com.
Love it. All right, everybody. Speaking of things that you'll love, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe. And until next time, my friends, be legendary. Take care. Peace. If you like this conversation, check out this episode to learn more.
We are being naive, not at least publicly entertaining the possibility that our antagonists abroad would take advantage of our famous lack of security. And you're going to see why we have to talk about genocide. Somebody has to open these topics if we are